Chapter 843. In fact, the energy that formed this axe was similarly deduced from the energy that defined the entire era of the Beast King. Even though it wasn't completely opposite, it was a type of energy that rejected it greatly. This energy emanated an aura of order. This power exuded an aura of order. As soon as it appeared, it naturally shook the surrounding void, causing the entire miniaturized universe to shake violently. There were originally countless spirals of light revolving around the Beast King's heart. When the axe appeared, they were naturally shaken violently, causing them to fall into chaos. They were like a flock of sheep that had encountered a lion, and they instantly scattered in all directions. During this process, they even collided with the surroundings, and it interweaved with the unusual changes caused by Luo Fan's earlier actions. It caused the entire miniature universe to fall into extreme chaos, and it was simply like the end of the world had arrived. Luo Fan paid no attention to all of this. After the axe condensed into form, he didn't hesitate at all to slash it down towards the Beast King's heart. At this moment, he didn't wait for the other Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators. He wanted to give them more time to comprehend the unusual changes in the era of the Beast King and figure out how to search for the core of this projection. This naturally wasn't because he wanted to be ahead of the other cultivators, because he knew that the core of the projection was extremely beneficial to him. It was because the era of the Beast King was unlike the other eras. Because the core of this projection was a peerlessly powerful being that could directly annihilate any Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivator. If such a being were to awaken, then it would cause a storm of blood, and even if all the 27 Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators were gathered here, they would absolutely be unable to resist it. Obviously, the more Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators gathered here, the higher the possibility of awakening this being. Thus, they didn't have the time to wait for the other Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators to arrive here, and they didn't have the time to comprehend how to search for the core of this projection. Only by taking swift action and annihilating the Beast King as soon as they had the chance would they be able to avoid any undue delays. Only by avoiding unexpected problems would they be able to overcome the Beast King's era more smoothly. In any case, this was only the second test, and there were still 9,997 tests remaining. Even the next few tests would still be the beginning, and they wouldn't be too difficult. There would still be opportunities for them to comprehend and search for a way. Without the second test, there wouldn't be much of a problem. It was precisely because of these considerations that Luo Fan had made such a prompt decision to kill the Beast King and destroy its heart. At the instant the axe struck towards the enormous heart, the heart suddenly trembled, and an unimaginable will suddenly blasted towards Luo Fan from all directions. This willpower was so powerful that it was indescribable. Even Luo Fan was like an ant in front of this willpower. It was as if this willpower could completely erase his existence from the infinite spacetime with just a slight pressure from this willpower. As expected, making a prompt decision was the right thing to do. Sure enough, the Beast King was awakened at the critical moment of its life. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Although that will was unimaginably powerful, it didn't directly affect Luo Fan's body. It didn't originate from where Luo Fan was. Instead, it came from other places, from other positions. Then, it attacked Luo Fan's location, wanting to erase him. As such, there was naturally a time difference between the time it was created and when Luo Fan encountered the pressure of this will. This time difference was almost non-existent to ordinary living beings, or even ordinary cultivators. Even those who could distinguish the speed of light would find it difficult to do so. However, after all, there was a time difference. After all, the two were not synchronized. With the power of Luo Fan's divine abilities and the fact that he was so close to the heart, he was practically sticking to it. Yet, he easily grasped this time difference. Before the will could reach his body, the axe had already smashed into the huge axe. Above the heart that was expanding and contracting. The axe was a power that was almost the complete opposite of the power that defined the Beast King's era. In other words, it was a power that was almost the complete opposite of the Beast King's nature. To the Beast King's body, especially its clearly fragile heart, this kind of power was extremely damaging. It had reached an unimaginable level. The heart could not withstand the axe's attack at all. In an instant it was split into two by the axe. As the heart was split into two, the void instantly collapsed and disappeared. The miniature universe in the surroundings instantly collapsed, turning into countless spatial powder that began to spread outwards. The thick layer of flesh that enveloped the miniature universe was like a bubble in the face of the spatial powder. It directly melted into the spatial powder and became a part of the spatial powder, causing the spatial powder to expand even more and spread even faster. The will that could wipe out any connate Grand Luo realm cultivator weakened at a speed that surpassed everything after the heart was split into two. Originally, it was already close to Luo Fan, and Luo Fan could almost touch its powerful might. However, when it really took effect on Luo Fan's body, it had weakened by hundreds of millions of times. From being able to easily wipe Luo Fan out of the infinite space and time, it could only make Luo Fan feel intense pain all over his body. He felt that his entire body, from the inside out, from the core of his spirit to the surface of his body, had suffered an indescribable bombardment. He almost completely collapsed and disappeared into nothingness. However, that was all. Almost, he still managed to pull through in the end. In the end, he still withstood the will that had weakened to the point of completely dissipating after it directly took effect on him. At that moment, a huge amount of information was born from nothingness. It directly flowed through his mind and consciousness, and was deeply engraved into the depths of his memories. That information was similar to the information when the projection core of the era of books was destroyed. It was also the remnants of the Beast King era, the evolution process of billions of years that was compressed into an instant. The appearance of this information meant that Luo Fan had succeeded. It meant that the projection core of the Beast King era had been destroyed, and the Beast King era had also been completely destroyed. He had already passed the second stage of the 9,999 checkpoints. I've finally succeeded. Luo Fan let out a long breath, and a faint smile appeared on his face. However, although he had such a smile on his face, the damage caused by the will just now did not disappear. It still remained on his body, causing him to look extremely miserable. His entire body was blood-red, as if all the blood in his body had been instantly compressed by an external force to the point of spurting out from his acupoints. His aura had already weakened to its limit, and he was not much better than a dead person. "Brother Luo, how did you suffer such a serious injury?" At that moment, a cry of surprise came from nearby. It was the martial emperor's voice. Luo Fan raised his head and saw that the world around him had changed unknowingly. It had returned to the starry sky of the universe. It was as if he had come out of the bridge of time and arrived at the Earth universe in the outside world. In front of him, the martial emperor, the heavenly fire Taoist, old man Tong Xiao, and the others who had entered the bridge of time together to head toward the era vortex were all hovering there. The person who spoke just now was the martial emperor who was flying toward him at high speed. The core of the Beast King era's projection is a powerful Beast King. When it was about to be destroyed, it resisted a little, so it suffered some minor injuries, Luo Fan said with a faint smile. At the same time, with a thought, the blood all over his body flowed back into his body. The blood returned to his body, and his body seemed to have recovered its usual calmness. Other than the fact that the aura around his body was still extremely weak, he looked no different from before. Beast King? The core of the Beast King era's projection is actually a living being. The martial emperor saw Luo Fan's reaction, and his expression relaxed slightly. However, he seemed to have thought of something, and his expression changed slightly. He asked, "Why can't it be a living being?" Why can't it be a living being? Luo Fan asked with a smile. This is the third test. It's the 137th era after the Age of Chaos, and it's called the Age of Emperors. The method to pass this test is to break through the era. At this moment, the voice of the treasure spirit of the era bridge resounded once more, and it allowed everyone to instantly understand where they were. The treasure spirit of the era bridge was formed from 36 Dharma treasures at the Great Perfection realm through some sort of profound method. It far surpassed the Great Perfection realm. Although it wasn't at the Saint realm, the might of its divine ability had reached a realm that most of the Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators present here couldn't even imagine. Therefore, the treasure spirit's understanding of the era bridge and the vortex of that era had reached an unimaginable height. It was precisely because of this that it was able to look down on everything from an extremely high altitude, and it provided all the Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators present here with a great deal of information, including the method to pass this test. I wonder if fellow Taoist Luo Fan can roughly explain the situation of the Beast King era's projection just now? Perhaps it'll be helpful to us in the next test. After hearing the treasure spirit's words, everyone didn't have much of a reaction. Instead, it was Old Man Omniscient who spoke to Luo Fan. After hearing the treasure spirit's words, everyone didn't have much of a reaction. Instead, it was Old Man Omniscient who spoke to Luo Fan. Many of the Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators present here were completely unfamiliar with the appearance of the core of the era projection. Among them, even Old Man Omniscient, they only found out about the existence of the era projection after they stepped foot on the era bridge. Only then did they understand the existence of the core of the era projection. Therefore, everything related to the core of the era projection was extremely important to them because it could greatly enrich their understanding of it. Based on the method to pass this test, it was obvious that there should be many tests like the era projection. It was even very likely that all the tests existed in such a form. Therefore, accumulating knowledge about the core of the era projection was rather important for the path to pass this test. As for why Luo Fan destroyed the core of the Beast King era's projection so quickly without giving them more time to understand and search for it, none of them doubted Luo Fan's intentions. After all, Luo Fan's current state was the best explanation. Luo Fan smiled and said, "Of course, that's not a problem." The situation of the core of the Beast King era's projection was indeed rather mysterious and had many special meanings. It meant that the core of the era projection had more possibilities and would not be limited to a single form. If he wanted to pass this test faster, it would naturally not be good to hide it. Subsequently, Luo Fan told the Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators in detail about the core of the Beast King era's projection. After that, Luo Fan explained the details of the Beast King era's projection core to the many Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators. Although he did not mention many details about his own cultivation method, the things he said alone were already an eye-opener for the Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators. They felt that their understanding of the era projection had greatly deepened. Although he did not mention many details that involved his own cultivation method, the things he said alone were already an eye-opener for the Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators. They felt that their understanding of the era projection had greatly deepened compared to before. There were even a dozen Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators who could not find the core of the era projection, no matter how hard they tried, were flushed with embarrassment. They realized that their knowledge was so shallow, and that there was such a huge gap between them and the person before them. After Luo Fan finished, the Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators looked at Luo Fan. They were filled with admiration and gratitude. They admired Luo Fan for being able to have such a deep understanding of the core of the era projection, but they were grateful that Luo Fan was willing to publicize it. That's how it is. I believe that if any of you were to encounter it in the future, you would not be able to escape. I believe that if you encounter it in the future, you should take it as a warning, said Luo Fan after he finished. Thank you, fellow Taoists. Old Man Omniscient was the one who gained the most out of everyone. After all, he had relied on his unimaginable knowledge to search for the core of the era projection. He had already formed a complete theory to search for the core of the era projection. At this moment, what Luo Fan said revealed a brand new theory, a complete system. It was a method of searching that did not differ from the theory he had formed. Such a theory could be said to be a brand new knowledge to him. And for him, who was collecting new knowledge to improve his cultivation realm, this was equivalent to directly improving his cultivation realm. Who could compare to the gains he gained? Since he gained the most, it meant that he had formed the most karma with Luo Fan because of Luo Fan's explanation, and he had no choice but to express his opinion. Luo Fan listened. He merely smiled and said, "There's no need for that. I'm just doing this to pass. No matter what. I will never forget your kindness, fellow Taoist." Old Man Omniscient did not relax at all and said. The other Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators expressed their gratitude to Luo Fan as well. After some conversation, Luo Fan said, "My body has yet to recover, and I need time to recover. I'm afraid I won't be able to do much in this stage. I'm afraid I'll have to rely on you to search for the core of the era projection." "Don't worry, fellow Taoists." Everyone naturally said so. After a few words, everyone dispersed and headed to various parts of the Emperor era to search for the core of the era projection. The last one to leave was still the martial monarch. After all, the martial monarch's relationship with Luo Fan was different from others. He naturally would not allow Luo Fan to stay here. "Brother Luo, you'll need someone to protect you when you recover." "Why don't I protect you?" the martial monarch said to Luo Fan. Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Brother Wu, you're worrying too much. Although my body has yet to recover, I'm not completely powerless. I don't need to put in all my effort, so why would I need someone to protect me? Brother Wu, hurry up and search for the core. Don't let others get ahead of you. Breaking through the core will bring you many benefits." The martial monarch carefully observed Luo Fan and sensed the changes in his body. He found that his body was more substantial than before, and his source energy was faintly suppressing him. He finally knew that Luo Fan was not lying. He indeed had the ability to protect himself and did not need his protection. He finally nodded with a smile and said, "Since that's the case, I won't say anything more." Luo Fan smiled and waved his hand, "Go quickly. It won't be good if you're late." The martial emperor smiled lightly, and after telling him to take care, he teleported and vanished without a trace. After the martial monarch left, Luo Fan shook his head. With a thought, he entered the perspective of power. At the same time, his body turned into nothingness, as if he did not exist at all. When the Beast King resisted before its death, his entire body, from the core of his spirit to the ends of his hair, had suffered an indescribable impact. He had almost collapsed and turned into nothingness. Even though he cultivated the inheritance of great strength Tao Sovereign and had the power to surpass the 9th stage of the immortal realm when he was at the 8th stage of the immortal realm, it was impossible for him to instantly recover from such injuries. At this moment, the injuries on the surface of his body had healed, but his spirit, his life origin, his mind, and his will were still in a state that was close to being exhausted. This state could be said to be the worst state he had ever been in since he condensed his body of power. It wasn't that easy to recover from it. At the very least, it was not like the injuries on the surface of his body, which could be completely recovered with a thought. If that was not the case, how could Luo Fan give up the opportunity to destroy the core of the projection of the Emperor era? After all, every time he destroyed the core of the projection, he would receive a backlash of information formed from the evolution of this era over billions of years. To any cultivator, as long as they were able to endure the impact, it would naturally be extremely beneficial. The information was sufficient to greatly strengthen any cultivator's comprehension of the world and the Grand Tao, and it would greatly reduce the obstacles in their path of cultivation. Unfortunately, even though Luo Fan was unwilling to give up, the current state of his body did not allow him to search for the core of the projection of the Emperor Era, and he was unable to find the core of the projection of the Emperor Era faster than other Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivators. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan gave up on searching for the core of the projection of the Emperor Era. At this moment, he had entered the perspective of power to isolate himself from all external influences and carefully heal the injuries on his spirit, mind, and will. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to the starting point. Vote for recommendations and monthly vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 844. Although the damage to his spirit, mind, and will was not fatal to Luo Fan, it was quite troublesome. If he was disturbed by others, it would definitely affect the healing process. Book Reading Network. Therefore, when he entered the world of power, his body also merged with the world of power. In such a state, unless other innate Grand Luo cultivators used special magic, it would be difficult for them to detect his presence, let alone affect him. Compared to letting a martial emperor guard him, this method could isolate him from the outside world and allow him to focus on healing his injuries. Even if it was Luo Fan himself, he could instantly find thousands of ways to heal his injuries. Moreover, in the inheritance of Tao Master Hercules, there was a special method to heal injuries of the body of strength. Chapter 883, The Emperor's Star. Time flew, and in the blink of an eye 3 years had passed. The 3 years on the Era Bridge were 30,000 years in the outside world, which was considered a long time. On this day, after entering the power view, Luo Fan, who had merged his body into the world of power, slowly got out of that state. His body condensed somewhere in the void. At this moment, his aura was hidden. Although it was not fully revealed, it was no longer as weak as 3 years ago. Instead, it revealed an indescribable sense of completeness and fullness. Looking at his face, there was a faint smile, and it was obvious that he was in a good mood. I didn't expect there to be some unexpected gains, and my control over my body has improved. It seems that the so-called breaking and building is not completely unreasonable. Luo Fan was in a good mood at this moment, and such a thought flashed across his mind. In the past 3 years, he had been constantly using the most suitable healing method for the body of strength recorded in the inheritance of Tao Master Hercules to heal the damage to his spirit, mind, and will. The healing method was mysterious and had an extremely amazing effect on the body of strength. Through the healing of Chapter 883, The Emperor's Star, not only did he completely recover from his injuries, but he also had a better control over his body and spirit because of this healing process. His mind, will allowed him to have a more detailed and perfect control over these things. At this moment, his cultivation level had not changed much compared to 3 years ago, but he felt that if he wanted to do what he could do 3 years ago, the amount of energy and thought he needed was slightly less than before. This change meant that his control over his body was much stronger than 3 years ago. After carefully sensing his own body, Luo Fan shifted his gaze and looked at the surrounding cosmic void. After comprehending for a bit, he roughly grasped the traces of the core projection of the Emperor Era. In the past 3 years, although he had been focused on healing and did not spend any energy searching for the core of the Era projection, he had always been in the perspective of that power. After all, his body had always been integrated into the world of power. In such a state, his body, his soul, his mind, and his thoughts were all in a daze. His will was instinctively familiar with the Emperor Era, instinctively searching for the similarities and differences between the Emperor Era, the Beast King Era, and the Scroll Era. All of these did not change when he was wholeheartedly focused on healing his injuries. However, at this moment, when he recovered his mind and began to pay attention, it instantly emerged from the depths of his heart, allowing him to easily grasp the differences, and thus grasped the traces of the core projection of the era. So it's this kind of power. No wonder it's called the Emperor era. Luo Fan carefully sensed, and revealed a smile as if he had grasped everything. From the perspective of power, what made any era become that era was power. In other words, perhaps there were many reasons that made an era become a certain era. It would be very complicated, very profound, and even indescribable with words. However, from the perspective of power, these could all become a kind of power, a power that contained all the reasons. Reading any era from this perspective, one would naturally be able to obtain a power that defined that era in any era. For example, the power that defined the scroll era. Why was it so complicated, requiring over 3,000 kinds of power to gather in one place to form? Was it not because it became a generalized power because of the perspective of power? In the eyes of others, it was definitely not a kind of power. Similarly, the Beast King era was the same. The power that defined the Beast King era was also a generalized power, formed from various factors that were not considered power in the eyes of others. The Emperor era was naturally no exception. What defined the Emperor era was similarly a power in a broad sense. This power was formed from the combination of over 6,300 kinds of power. Its nature was extremely profound, containing the characteristics of gathering, entrusting, controlling, bloodthirsty, educating, and protecting. As it circulated, it could naturally find individuals with the most suitable characteristics among all living beings, allowing those individuals to receive buffs, allowing them to possess the characteristics of various emperors. After sensing this power, Luo Fan did not even need to look. He only needed to think for a moment to know that there were countless emperors in the Emperor era, and those who occupied the peak of this era and controlled the situation of this era were definitely powerful emperors, emperors who stood above all living beings. However, this did not mean anything to Luo Fan. Luo Fan's thoughts moved slightly. His figure merged into the world of power and followed the traces left by the core of the Emperor era projection that he saw. He quickly advanced towards the core of the Emperor era projection that might exist. With the accumulation of his instincts over the past 3 years, his movements were unimaginably smooth. In just a short 3 days, he had traversed hundreds of millions of light-years and arrived in the void. It was where the projection core of the Emperor era should be. Arriving at this place, he left the field of vision of the power. Just as his figure appeared in the normal world, he heard a cry of surprise. "I knew Brother Luo would find me, but I didn't expect you to be so fast." It was the voice of a martial emperor. Luo Fan turned his head and saw several innate great Luo realm cultivators hovering in the void. One of them was a martial emperor. I thought fellow Luo Fan would need a few more years to find this place due to his injuries, but I didn't expect him to only be 3 months slower than me. How impressive! At this moment, Old Man Knowing could not help but speak up. At this moment, the cultivators hovering there were the martial emperor, Old Man Knowing, Taoist Skyfire, and Sky Maiden. Apart from Old Man Knowing, they happened to be the first few people that Taoist Skyfire had invited. Luo Fan had a thought when he saw them. He understood that the first to arrive was definitely the martial emperor, followed by Old Man Knowing, followed by Taoist Skyfire and Sky Maiden. Although I've been focused on healing my injuries for the past 3 years, my body has been searching for this place subconsciously. It's not commendable that I'm able to arrive at this moment. Luo Fan said with a smile after seeing the order of their arrival. As he spoke, the martial emperor had already arrived beside Luo Fan. He sized up Luo Fan for a while before sighing in relief and saying, "Brother Luo, you've really recovered from your injuries. I'm relieved now." Luo Fan's aura was currently concealed, not revealing anything at all. However, the martial emperor was a powerful being who had truly stepped onto the path of Tao. Although he could not sense the exact situation within his body, He could sense the aura coming from Luo Fan's body and tell if he was in perfect condition. Luo Fan could not help but smile after hearing the martial emperor's words. He could not help but smile and say, "Do you think I'd lie to you, Brother Wu?" "Ha ha!" The martial emperor laughed when he heard that. He then went to where Old Man Knowing and the others were with Luo Fan. The group chatted for a while. As expected, the martial emperor was the first to arrive here a year and a half ago and found the location of the projection core of the Emperor era. Then, Old Man Knowing found this place 3 months ago. 2 months after that, Daoist Skyfire arrived. Daoist Skyfire rushed over. About 10 days ago, the empty maiden barely made it here. Luo Fan looked at the Sky Maiden and saw that she still had a calm expression, as if nothing could cause her expression to change. He could not help but sigh. The Sky Maiden's cultivation was the lowest among the 27 innate Grand Luo who stepped onto the bridge of the era. She had only just become an innate Grand Luo. However, it was obvious that she must have some special methods to be able to find the core of the Emperor era's projection so quickly with her insignificant cultivation. In fact, the power of her divine abilities was not as weak as they seemed on the surface. However, none of that mattered. She did not have any conflict with Luo Fan at the moment, nor was there any karma between them. The Sky Maiden's gaze froze slightly when she saw Luo Fan looking at her, but her expression did not change at all. Luo Fan merely smiled and nodded. He then shifted his gaze to the core of the Emperor era's projection. The core was not a living being like the Beast King era, but it was not a void like the Scroll era either. The core of the Emperor era's projection was a planet. It was a lonely planet without any stars around it, and it did not belong to any galaxy. The planet was more than 300 times larger than Earth. The many innate Grand Luo cultivators present were insignificant compared to it. However, such a planet was as insignificant as a speck of dust compared to the entire Earth and the Emperor era. With a slight thought, the situation inside and outside the planet was instantly sensed by Luo Fan's consciousness. "I see. I didn't expect it to be so profound." Luo Fan could not help but exclaim inwardly when he sensed that. The planet was extremely similar to the pantheon that Luo Fan read in novels in his past life, when he was still immortal. The entire planet was, in fact, a huge palace. There were countless buildings on it. The buildings were majestic, and the materials they were built with were so tough that they were almost indestructible. The appearance of the countless buildings made them look like imperial palaces. At every moment, there would be buildings collapsing into nothingness, and at the same time, there would be buildings appearing out of thin air at every moment. The pantheon would form a divine throne when any deity was born, and when the deity died, the divine throne it represented would collapse and disappear. Every time a building disappeared on the planet, it represented the death of an emperor and the destruction of a country. Every building that was formed represented the birth of a powerful emperor in this Earth's universe, or in other words, an emperor's country had become powerful to a certain level. Buildings were born and destroyed at every moment, which meant that there were emperors dying and countries being destroyed at every moment, and there were emperors who had reached the requirements. Luo Fan carefully sensed the many buildings on the planet, and he discovered that the buildings were extremely closely connected to the power that permeated the entire Earth's universe and defined the Emperor era. This connection caused the buildings to be connected to the fates of the emperors who were billions of light years away in various parts of the Earth's universe. And this connection, it was not just a connection of fate on the surface, but an extremely close connection that could even allow the avatars of the emperors to descend. Even at this moment, there were tens of thousands of emperors overseeing these buildings. They were communicating, trading, bonding, or fighting. It was like another world. "This is the Emperor Star, right?" Luo Fan sighed and said. "That's right. That's indeed what they call this planet." The martial emperor had stayed here for the longest, so he had the most right to speak. He smiled and said, "With this planet, the rule of the emperors in the Emperor era is unshakable. No wonder it's called the Emperor Era. Luo Fan sighed. However, the material of this planet is rather tough. It's impossible to destroy it with ordinary methods. Brother Luo, do you have any way to teach me? The martial emperor suddenly thought of something. He frowned slightly and said, Haha, what's so difficult about that? Although the material of this planet is amazing, it also has a weakness. As long as Brother Wu grasps the weakness, you don't need too much power to destroy it. Luo Fan chuckled and said, I've been here for a year and a half, but I haven't found any weakness. Brother Luo, you've found it so quickly? The martial emperor said in admiration. Quick, teach me. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about the martial emperor's impoliteness. He smiled and raised his hand to point at a certain location on the emperor's star. The martial emperor was slightly stunned when he saw where Luo Fan was pointing. Then his eyes suddenly lit up and he laughed. I see. No wonder I couldn't find it. I forgot that the strongest place is also the weakest place. The place Luo Fan was pointing at was none other than the Emperor's star. It was the grandest building, made of the toughest material, and had the strongest aura. The aura that emanated from it was not weaker than a connate zenith realm cultivator at all. The material it was made of was thousands of times harder than other buildings. Such a building was the most powerful building on the Emperor's star. The emperor that it belonged to was also the most powerful emperor in the Earth universe. Practically all the emperors on the Emperor's star had to respect him, and they even revolved around him in order to be able to exist steadily on the planet. This was naturally the strongest aspect of the Emperor's star. In a sense, the strongest point could also be said to be the weakest point. As long as the martial emperor destroyed this building, he would be able to enter the planet through the connection between the building and the planet, and then destroy the entire planet from within. Then, the projection of the entire era of emperors would be destroyed along with it. After understanding this, the martial emperor finally relaxed, and a happy smile appeared on his face. He said, Then I can rest assured. All I have to do now is wait. Brother Wu, don't be careless. The amount of information that's poured into this era when it's destroyed is quite large. If you're careless, you might even suffer irreparable injuries. You have to make more preparations. Luo Fan could not help but remind the martial emperor when he saw him like this. I know. The martial emperor smiled. Although it wasn't that he didn't take it seriously, he felt that he had made all preparations, and it was impossible for him to be unable to bear it. When Luo Fan saw him like this, it wasn't appropriate for him to say anything else. He could only hope that the martial emperor had taken it seriously and made sufficient preparations. After that, Luo Fan and the martial emperor didn't say anything else. They just sat quietly in space and observed the Emperor's star before them. They comprehended the profundities within it, and they hoped to comprehend some profundities of the era of emperors from it so that it would be beneficial to their own cultivation. Time passed slowly during this process. In the blink of an eye, another 3 years passed. After 3 years, most of the innate golden immortal realm cultivators had found this place, and only 6 or 7 innate golden immortal realm cultivators were still unable to find this place. It was unknown if it was because they weren't good at finding the core of this projection, or if they were delayed by something. 6 years. This was the tacit waiting time for the first test. Thus, when 6 years were up, it was still Taoist Heavenfire who summoned the remaining 7 innate golden immortal realm cultivators that were scattered throughout Earth's universe. Those cultivators were naturally rather ashamed, and they walked to the side in embarrassment. They seized the time to comprehend the profundities of the projection core of the era of emperors so that they could perform better next time. When the martial emperor saw that everyone had arrived, he gestured to Luo Fan and the others before he took a step forward and arrived in front of them, facing the enormous Emperor's star. The martial emperor had been in front of the Emperor's star for 5.5 years. During this period of time, he had been thinking about how to destroy this star at every single moment. By now, he had a plan in mind. After he took a step forward, he didn't hesitate at all. He exerted a little force with his legs and pushed himself up slightly in space. The space around him was originally empty, but under his actions, it seemed to have become extremely solid, and it trembled violently. The space was like soft plasticine, and with the martial emperor as the center, countless ripples spread out in all directions. To be continued. If you like this work, I welcome you to come to the starting point. Vote for me, vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 845. As this happened, the martial power within the martial emperor's body surged. He raised his hand and punched out unhurriedly. Text first appeared. That punch seemed extremely simple, as if it was just a punch thrown out with brute force. However, it contained boundless martial arts mysteries, as well as the countless martial arts principles that the martial emperor had comprehended in his life. Every single change seemed to be a display of the great path of martial arts, allowing the spectators to take advantage of it as they wished. As he moved, the space around the martial emperor turned into countless spatial powders without any abnormalities. As he moved, the powders scattered in all directions. The martial emperor's punch had only been thrown out without any power condensing. However, right after he punched out, the most majestic palace on the emperor's star in front of him suddenly shook, and the palace was silently crushed into dust by a huge fist imprint. As this happened, the entire Supreme Emperor's star started to tremble violently. It wasn't just the Supreme Emperor's star. The entire Supreme Emperor's era and the entire Earth's universe started to tremble violently. Suddenly, an indescribable existence descended from the sky and landed on the martial emperor's body. This existence was extremely profound and contained boundless might. Almost anything that was enveloped by it would be destroyed, and any universe would be destroyed by it. This was the Supreme Emperor's era's instinctive resistance. The martial emperor had long since expected this existence to descend. He did not panic, nor did he try to resist. Instead, he pulled back his fist and quietly waited. What he wanted to do had already been done in the previous punch. At this moment, as long as they waited, the emperor's star would naturally be destroyed. This mysterious existence that had descended from the unseen world and represented the existence that the Earth universe instinctively resisted would also be destroyed by the destruction of the Emperor's star. As expected, that existence took effect on him. However, before it could completely materialize, the Emperor's star in front of him suddenly began to crack from the inside out, and countless cracks grew larger and larger. The cracks were densely packed, and the entire Supreme Emperor's star seemed to be formed by countless tiny fragments. These cracks quickly widened to a limit. In an instant, the entire Supreme Emperor's star exploded, turning into countless tiny fragments. As it exploded, the entire universe, the entire Supreme Emperor era, and even that mysterious existence that had descended from the unseen world and wanted to wipe out the martial emperors collapsed and disappeared at the same time. A scene of the end of the world spreading in all directions from the location of the emperor's star. Very quickly, a huge change occurred. This doomsday-like scene should have been absolutely lethal to the living beings within it. However, the innate golden immortal realm cultivators present weren't affected at all. They floated there, and the scene of the end of the world was like an illusory image. It brushed past them, but it didn't affect them at all. It didn't hurt them at all. Chapter 846. Currently, more than a year had passed since the innate Grand Luo cultivators stepped into the projection of the Heavenly Rat era. Text first. Following that, some cultivators found their way here and saw Luo Fan and the others. They were not surprised to see Luo Fan, but they found it hard to believe that the martial monarch was conversing with Luo Fan as if nothing had happened. They were already used to Luo Fan being faster than them in the previous few stages. Now that he was the first to discover the projection core of the Heavenly Rat era, they were naturally not surprised. However, the appearance of the martial monarch, who had disappeared from several stages and eras, was beyond their expectations. Of course, this kind of surprise was naturally different for every cultivator. Some cultivators felt that the martial monarch had recovered too quickly. It was beyond their imagination, allowing them to have a more direct understanding of the martial monarch's strength. Some, like Old Man Omniscient, found it difficult to understand why the martial monarch had recovered so slowly. However, they had more guesses about the strength of the backlash from the projection core. But no matter what, it was impossible for them to disregard the existence of the martial monarch at all. They still came to greet the martial monarch and communicate with each other. Of course, they mostly asked the martial monarch about the backlash from the core projection, how terrifying it was, and what sort of methods could be used to endure it. There was nothing to hide about this. As such, the martial monarch did not think much of it. He directly told the innate Grand Luo cultivators about the situation. When the cultivators heard the martial monarch's words, their expressions fluctuated. The backlash from the destruction of the Era projection core was very clear, and it was also very simple. There were no more secrets at all, it was just a simple act of pouring endless information into the mind of the creature that destroyed the core. However, it was this simple backlash that contained no secrets that was the hardest to resist. Unless he had a powerful defense that could completely isolate this information, he could only rely on his own mind, his own spirit. One had to rely on one's own will to endure the information and work hard to sort it out. From this point of view, the martial monarch's words did not make much of a difference, because Luo Fan had already said all of this back then. Perhaps the only meaning behind the martial emperor's words was to allow them to truly understand just how great the amount of information was. After all, the example of the martial monarch was right before their eyes. Even a powerful existence like the martial monarch had only awakened after being immersed in the boundless information for several decades, let alone these people who believed that they were far inferior to the martial monarch. Everyone's expressions kept changing. Luo Fan watched calmly from the side. His mind was not affected by their changes at all. This time, more than half of the Grand Luo innate realm cultivators had arrived when the 3 years of the Heavenly Mouse era's projection had passed. At that moment, Luo Fan said, "We've wasted too much time in the first 10 levels. Why don't we stop waiting?" Luo Fan was the first to arrive here, so he naturally had the most say. Even if the others had different opinions, it was not appropriate for them to voice it out. After all, Luo Fan had been waiting here for more than 2 years. That was already giving him a lot of face. Thus, everyone could only say, "That's how it should be." Chapter 847. Out of the 11 checkpoints that he had passed, only one of them had been taken by the martial emperor due to his own reasons. In other words, at this moment, in Luo Fan's memory, he had already accumulated the history of 10 eras from prosperity to destruction. There were 10 eras, and there was naturally a sequence between each one. Evidently, if he arranged the information in order, he would be able to see the general history of the universe. Of course, there were only 10 eras after all, and there were long and short intervals between these eras. Hence, the history that was arranged was extremely fragmented, and it was impossible to see the logical connection between them. Luo Fan carefully analyzed this information and tried hard to integrate it into one. In the end, he found that it was simply impossible to do so with his accumulation at this moment. The time between these eras was too great, and it was difficult to obtain any reference. Naturally, he would not give up so easily. With a slight thought, his figure merged into nothingness, and his vision once again entered the power view. Following that, he broke down the historical process of the 10 eras bit by bit, and conducted an extremely detailed analysis. He believed that no matter how fragmented it was, as long as there was a time connection between them, there would definitely be a logical connection between them. The reason why he could not find it was because he did not search deep enough, But it did not mean that the logical connection did not exist. This process was an astonishingly grand process. Even Luo Fan could not be distracted. He could only wholeheartedly focus on it, and try his best to analyze the logical connection. Time passed quickly, and in the blink of an eye, a year had passed. If he were to sort out the information from scratch, even if it was an era's historical process, it would not be finished in a short year. The previous martial emperor had spent over 40 years to recover from the historical process of the martial emperor era. He did not even have the time to sort it out. However, it was clear that Luo Fan did not start from scratch. The countless pieces of information were already lying quietly in the depths of his memory. In fact, he had already understood them a long time ago. At this moment, as long as he willed it, it would naturally be brought out, and he would naturally place it in a suitable position. There was no need for him to develop it bit by bit and sort it out bit by bit. In such a situation, it would naturally not take much time. Therefore, although he had only been in that state for a short year, he had already sorted out every historical process of the 10 eras. However, he had already sorted out every single bit of history in those 10 eras and compared all the logical connections that might exist in his knowledge. In the end, he did not know whether he should be disappointed or happy. This was because during the process, he did not find any logical connections at all. This was definitely beyond Luo Fan's expectations, because Luo Fan's comparison did not only compare some aspects of the two most recent eras, but also integrated all the eras and compared that aspect of all the eras. This comparison was not only based on the connections between them. Instead, it was to look at the differences between them, to see if these differences would increase with the increase of the gap between eras, and if there would be any other changes due to the increase of the gap between eras. Even so, there was no trace of any logical connection. How could anyone not be surprised? Either there isn't any connection between these eras at all, the so-called eras after the cultivationless age are all false, only related to the cultivationless age. Or I haven't searched thoroughly enough. Those connections are hidden even deeper. Luo Fan frowned and thought to himself. At this moment, his figure had reappeared in the universe on Earth, sitting cross-legged and floating in the void. It seemed that even light could not escape from his body, let alone reveal any aura. No matter which of the two possibilities he had guessed in his mind, both of them represented many things. If the first possibility was that the so-called eras after the end of days were only related to the end of days, and that there was no connection between the eras, then it meant that this projection wasn't as mysterious as he had thought it to be. This was enough to make Luo Fan happy, because it meant that his original body might not have perished. If it was the second possibility, it meant that there was a deeper mystery behind it. Otherwise, how could the connection be hidden so deeply? However, this would make him disappointed, because it meant that the possibility of his original body perishing was greatly increased. Although there were two possibilities, Luo Fan was more inclined to the first one. This was a form of confidence. Even if he admitted that he might not be able to discover the deeper connection, he was more confident that if he could not discover it, it did not exist. Looks like there's not enough information. No matter which possibility is the truth, if I want to discover the truth, I must continue to accumulate more information and continue to break through more barriers. As Luo Fan thought so, his thoughts moved slightly, and he began to search for the core of this projection of the Divine Tao era. He had done this many times, and his movements were extremely smooth and natural. In an instant, he had grasped the traces of the core of the projection of the Age of Gods in the world of power. Like the other eras, the definition of the Age of Gods was also a power. This power was extremely mysterious, being condensed from over 7,000 different powers. Its property was that it could condense the wandering thoughts of living beings, turning them into a mysterious existence that had indescribable effects on living beings. It could then be used by living beings that corresponded with the living being's thoughts, allowing that living being to obtain extraordinary abilities. I see. This is the truth of the age of gods. The existence condensed from the living being's thoughts should be faith. As these thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, his figure had already traced the traces of the core of the projection of the age of gods that he had observed before, heading towards where the core of the projection of the age of gods was. The age of gods was clearly vastly different from the age of chaos. There were gods in the age of chaos as well, but those gods were gods that directly grasped certain rules, principles, or aspects of the great Tao. In essence, those gods were still cultivators. It was just that the methods they cultivated were different from connate zenith heaven cultivators. And this was the age of gods. That was not the case. There were clearly gods in the age of gods as well, but those gods absorbed faith and relied on it to exist. Such gods. This was because one could only exist by relying on faith. Thus, as long as one lost faith, one would fall. Moreover, because of these beliefs, one would be affected, changing one's will and consciousness. In comparison, compared to the gods of the age of chaos, they were much weaker. Of course, according to what Luo Fan saw, the gods of the age of gods were not without strengths compared to the gods of the age of chaos. At the very least, there was no limit to the gods of the age of gods below the saints. As long as there was enough faith, they could even crush connate zenith heaven cultivators like ant. That was not the case for the gods of the age of gods. Because the era they lived in was the age of chaos, the universe's suppression on cultivators. It would also appear on the gods. That made it so that no matter how powerful the divine abilities of the gods were, they could only reach the connate zenith heaven level at most. There were even some like the god of time, who were only equivalent to the immortal level. Luo Fan's speed was quite fast. In just a short 10 days, he had already traced the source and arrived at a certain void in the Earth's universe, seeing the core of the projection of the age of gods. This core was beyond Luo Fan's expectations. It was completely different from the cores of the 11 projections he had seen before. It was a giant sun. Not a star, but a sun. It was the sun formed by the sun god of myths and legends. The sun hovered in the void, emanating boundless light and heat. It possessed boundless light and boundless holiness. It was even the source of the power that defined the entire age of God. Every moment, boundless energy emanated from the sun and converged into the power, causing the power to grow stronger and the divine path laws of the entire Earth's universe to become more and more stable. That power was also being fed back into the sun at the same time. That kind of feedback was nothing else. It was the faith condensed from the will of countless living beings. There were countless gods in the age of gods. At least, based on what Luo Fan could sense, there were hundreds of millions of gods, and the powerful ones among them were not any weaker than he was right now. However, the number of living beings in the age of God's universe on Earth was trillions of times more than the God. Even though the wandering will emanating from so many living beings supported so many gods, there were still even more wandering wills that were not absorbed by the gods. After the wandering wills that were not absorbed were converted into faith, they were all channeled into the giant sun before him. Through this sun, he formed even more power of the divine Tao that defined this era of the divine Tao. The divine laws in turn increased the wandering wills emanating from the living beings, forming a complete cycle that made the age of gods flourish and the divine laws of the age of gods more and more stable. If this was in this era, it would be the so-called Lord of Radiance, or the God of Creation. Luo Fan could not help but sigh. The sun was so grand, so vast, and so profound. However, to Luo Fan and the many connate Grand Luo who had stepped onto the bridge of time, it was an existence that had to be destroyed no matter how grand, vast, or profound it was. Naturally, he felt that it was a pity. With a slight thought, Luo Fan understood that he was indeed the fastest to arrive here. As he completely relaxed, he began to wonder if the other connate Grand Luo cultivators would find anything. He pondered for a moment before he withdrew his thoughts and concentrated on the sun before him, carefully comprehending its profundities. The divine laws that existed in this era were useful for Luo Fan to learn from. He could faintly sense that this power was rather useful for his cultivation. This kind of divine Tao power that condensed the wandering thoughts of many other living beings was meaningless to Luo Fan, but the thoughts contained within could be used by him to gather power, or to nourish this will clone, or to nourish his main body. It was all possible. After all, from the perspective of power, living beings were also condensed from various powers. Therefore, the wandering wills of living beings were naturally a form of power as well. Since they were all a form of power, the divine law's act of condensing wandering wills into faith was naturally equivalent to condensing certain powers into faith. If one could comprehend the fundamental principles behind it, they would naturally be able to use the same method to condense specific powers at will, forming even more mysterious powers. For example, with a single thought, one could condense the various powers that were scattered throughout the earth and the universe into physical strength. Or they could be condensed into martial strength, intelligence, and so on. Condensing these various powers would not directly benefit the will clone that cultivated the Tao of power, but it would allow him to control the essence of power more perfectly and comprehend the profundities of power at a deeper level. As for other living beings that did not cultivate the Tao of power, for example, his main body would have many benefits. For example, he could use this method to attach boundless physical strength, intelligence, martial strength, and so on to his main body, allowing his main body to be countless times stronger. However, it was clear that while his future was extremely bright, the path ahead was full of twists and turns. Although this kind of power was condensed from more than 7,000 different kinds of power, it was not enough. Luo Fan completely understood these 7,000 types of powers, and he could condense them at will. However, why these 7,000 types of powers would combine to form this divine laws, and why it would produce such miraculous effects, was not something that could be understood in a short period of time. Even a connate Grand Luo realm cultivator like Luo Fan would need to expend boundless energy to understand the uncanny workmanship of the universe. In the process of Luo Fan's comprehension, time passed by slowly. Unknowingly, 9 years had passed just like that. Soon enough, he arrived at the place that they had agreed upon. It was time to break the era projection. During these 9 years, living beings found this place one after another. However, their numbers were much lesser than before. After 9 years, only less than 10 people, including the martial emperor, Old Man Omniscient, Taoist Heaven Fire, and the Sky Maiden, had found this place. Clearly, it was not that others could not find this place. Instead, it was because they were still searching for things that they were familiar with. They were still searching for existences that might be related to the age of degeneration. Not everyone was like Luo Fan, who had only stayed on Earth for a few 100,000 years. The other connate Grand Luo realm cultivators had at least lived on Earth for a few billion years. After such a long period of time, the traces they left in the universe were naturally enormous. There would naturally be many who still had traces even after 7 or 8 eras. Compared to the scale of the universe that spanned who knew how many light years, 10 years was not enough for them to go through every possible location where traces might exist. The connate Grand Luo realm cultivators who had yet to appear were clearly unwilling to give up hope. They would rather continue searching for those traces until the very last moment. As for the martial emperor and the others, while they also left countless traces in Earth's universe, they were more rational. After searching several locations that might have traces but to no avail, they understood that there was nothing to be gained even if they continued searching. It was more useful to communicate with others of the same path, which was why they found this place and arrived at the core of the era of divine Tao projection. When the final moment arrived and no more connate Grand Luo realm cultivators arrived, Luo Fan said to the Taoist Heaven Fire, "It seems like none of you are in the mood to come. Why don't we stop waiting? Let me talk to them first, the Taoist Heaven Fire said with a sigh. Luo Fan was naturally indifferent. He nodded and said nothing else. When the Taoist Heaven Fire saw this, he activated the method he had agreed upon with the others and began asking them. In the end, not a single cultivator was willing to give up. Even if the era of divine Tao was about to be destroyed, they were unwilling to give up on the hope of gaining something at the very last moment. They were even unwilling to waste time coming to the core of the era of divine Tao projection. Luo Fan and the others did not agree with this choice. However, they did not think that it was stupidity or stubbornness. After all, every connate Grand Luo Realm cultivator had their own persistence and their own way of doing things. Their perseverance, their refusal to give up any hope, however remote, until the last moment, was an element of success. Looks like they're still unwilling to give up. They want to see if those familiar places will reveal traces of the past the instant the projection of the era disappears. The martial emperor sighed after the Taoist Heaven Fire ended his communication with the others. Perhaps that's also a method. We can only wish them well. The Taoist Heaven Fire sighed as well. There was no doubt that a world-shaking change would occur at the end of an era. The changes might reveal many secrets that were originally hidden in the depths. Everyone agreed with this point. However, they did not think that they would gain anything by waiting there. In comparison, they were more willing to stay and see what secrets the core of the era of divine Tao projection had, and how it was destroyed. There was no difference between the two choices. They were just different choices. Seeing that they had reached an agreement, Luo Fan did not hesitate. He took a step forward and charged into the huge sun without hesitation. The sun was incomparably huge. It was more than 100 times larger than an ordinary star. Although it was not as huge as the core of the era of Beast Kings, it had the same characteristics. If they wanted to destroy it in the outside world, they would need to spend a lot of time. If that happened, they might have to endure the great resistance of the era of divine Tao, which would cause unnecessary problems. That was why Luo Fan did what he did. To be continued. Chapter 848. At this moment, the innate Grand Luo cultivators on the Bridge of Times lacked nothing but time. The era of imagination actually had such a miraculous effect. It was able to create a world where the flow of time was 10,000 times faster than the era projection. This clearly made up for what they lacked. Under such circumstances, no matter how stupid the martial emperor was, he would not let go of this opportunity. Moreover, the martial emperor was extremely intelligent, and he was someone who could create his own grand Tao of martial arts. After sending everyone to their rooms to cultivate, the martial emperor heaved a sigh of relief. Apart from maintaining his own space of imagination, he also entered a state of cultivation. In the blink of an eye, 3,000 years had passed. These 3,000 years were naturally the 3,000 years in the martial world projected by the era of imagination, and not the 3,000 years in the era of imagination. In other words, it was equivalent to 3,000 years in the universe on Earth. In total, it was only slightly more than 3 months for the era of imagination projection. To the innate Grand Luo cultivators who had stepped onto the Bridge of Times, this period of time was a waste. During these 3,000 years, the innate Grand Luo cultivators who had fallen into slumber due to the backlash from the era projection woke up one after another. However, they knew that this was a rare opportunity, but they did not suggest to destroy the era of imagination projection and head to the 400th stage. Instead, they either stayed in the martial world created by the martial emperor, or they left the martial world and headed to the era of imagination projection. It was not difficult for them to imagine a world on their own on this day. After 3,000 years in the world of martial arts, a strange ripple suddenly spread out in all directions from the cultivation room the martial emperor had placed Luo Fan in. It instantly engulfed the entire world of martial arts, even breaking through the boundaries of the world of martial arts. It was transmitted to the projections of the Utopia era in the outside world, causing a violent reaction from the projections of the Utopia era. Brother Luo. Although the martial world was formed according to the martial emperor's imagination, it completely relied on the martial emperor's imagination. However, it completely relied on the martial emperor's imagination after all. So, the martial emperor's ability to sense the martial dimension surpassed all other golden immortals. In an instant, he sensed the changes where Luo Fan was. With a slight movement of his mind, his figure had already arrived outside the room where Luo Fan was. Besides the martial emperor, the other golden immortal realm cultivators had successively found out about the changes that occurred here, and they understood that something had happened to Luo Fan, so they rushed over successively. At this moment, in Luo Fan's cultivation room, an incomparably powerful aura suddenly erupted and instantly filled the entire martial world, causing the entire martial world to shake violently along with the collision of this aura. An indescribable majesty, an indescribable power, instantly eroded the minds of everyone present. This allowed them to understand that an existence that was countless times stronger than them had awakened. How can he be so powerful? This had clearly far surpassed the Khanate Grand Luo, though it was not at the level of a saint. However, he is more than 10 million times stronger than us. How could Luo Fan have made such great progress in just a few thousand years? How is this possible? This was the only thought that flashed in the minds of the innate Grand Luo cultivators at this moment. At this moment, not only did they feel powerful from the aura in front of them, but they also felt powerless in the face of such an aura, the pressure of the origin. It was as if the aura before them had far surpassed them in essence. To them, such a fact had completely surpassed the limits of their knowledge. In the eyes of these innate Grand Luo cultivators, the Khanate Grand Luo realm was the strongest realm below the saints. In this realm, the difference between living beings might be infinitely huge, and it was even possible for them to be worlds apart. But in essence, they were all the same. There was no difference between them. It was impossible for there to be a difference in essence. However, at this moment, such an impossible situation had appeared before them without any preparation. It was highly likely that the powerful existence in front of them was Luo Fan, and it was unknown how many times higher than them. This was simply destroying their concept. How could they not be shocked and feel that it was unimaginable? While everyone was shocked, Luo Fan's body floated up in the room and slowly stretched out from his original sitting posture in the air. The peerlessly powerful aura spread out in all directions as he stretched out. It filled the entire martial world, and at the same time, it shocked the innate Grand Luo cultivators in the martial world. He slowly opened his eyes, and there seemed to be the shadows of countless eras flashing through his eyes, forming an extremely grand picture of time. It's finally done. So, this is the perishment realm. Luo Fan gradually retracted his aura as such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, the world in his eyes and the world he felt had undergone a complete change compared to before. An indescribable and strange existence filled the entire world and universe in his eyes. This strange existence was like a magnifying glass. It magnified all the rules and laws of the universe, as well as the fundamental principles hidden behind them, and displayed them in front of him. It was as if he could use them at will and study them at will. In a daze, he felt that the might of his divine ability was more than 1,000 times stronger than before. Moreover, the strength was not just in terms of quantity, but it was also in essence. Using the same divine ability, the consumption of his energy was many times less than before. For example, he might need to spend hundreds of years of cultivation to open up a colossal world. But at this moment, if he wanted to open up a colossal world, he only needed to spend a few years or even a few months. One could imagine how huge and terrifying this difference was. It turns out that the perishment realm, the void enlightenment realm, the Tao integration realm, the transcendent realm, and the Tao Master Realm don't have to break through to the 9th stage of the Immortal Realm to reach. As long as I understand the mystery, even if I don't break through to the 9th stage of the Immortal Realm, I can still become an exterminator, a void enlightenment realm, a Tao integration realm, a transcendent realm, and even a Tao Master. Such a thought suddenly became clear in Luo Fan's mind. The reason why he had such an understanding was because he was very clear that at this moment, although he was still at the peak of the 8th stage of the Immortal Realm, he was indeed an exterminator. According to the division of realms in the Great Tianyuan world, one must surpass the 9th stage of the Immortal Realm to become an exterminator. Indeed, that's the right way. These 5 realms. It's clear that the understanding of these 5 realms is not closely related to the strength itself. As long as one understands them, even if one's strength has not reached that level, one can still reach that realm. The reason why it's said that one can only reach that realm after reaching the 9th stage of the Immortal Realm is naturally because under normal circumstances, only after reaching the 9th stage of the Immortal Realm would one have the chance to understand those realms. Luo Fan was in a daze. He had already understood the truth behind the 5 realms. An indescribable joy surged in his heart. During these 3,000 years, he had entered the deepest state of seclusion and had no sense of what was happening in the outside world. After all, he had stepped onto the bridge of time to increase his own cultivation realm. Since that was the case, he naturally would not neglect the essentials and give up on the chance to break through just because of the problem of clearing the stage. Therefore, even if he knew that seclusion would greatly affect the other's mission, he didn't care at all. He didn't care at all. He just broke through. These years, he had improved greatly and it was obviously worth it for him to do so. Apart from raising his cultivation realm to the peak of the 8th stage of the Immortal Realm and comprehending the essence of exterminator, becoming an exterminator, he had also understood the doubts he had back then from the information of the 300 era projections. That was about whether or not his original body still existed and whether or not these era projections were the true era projections that had developed from the end of days. Because that was the information backlash he had received from the last era projection, and it happened to make up for a certain key node of the many era projections information he had received. Most of the information he had received was strung together, and at that time, he could see the Earth universe's history of billions and trillions of years. And the result? It made him feel both surprised and natural. What surprised him was the fact. What made him feel natural was that this fact didn't exceed his initial 2 speculations. There was no definite connection between the information backlash of the various era projections. This meant that although these era projections were said to be the projections of several eras after the end of days, they were in fact not truly related to time. They were in fact all relative, and were only related to the end of days. The reasoning behind this wasn't complicated. Even mortals in the secular world could understand this reasoning. The past was something that had already happened and was completely confirmed. It was the only existence. As for the future, it had yet to happen. There were countless possibilities and it could be changed by countless choices. Therefore, there was only one kind of past. Going back to the past meant going back to the continuous past. However, there were countless futures. Any simple change in the environment, any different choice made by even the most insignificant of living beings would create a completely different future. From this, the above conclusion was that these eras were all eras after the end of days after the countless futures develop. In other words, the era of divine path, the 8th era after the end of days, was only one of the countless 8th eras that might exist. As for the other hundreds of eras after the end of days, they were only one of the countless eras that might exist. And the era before the end of days, the 8th era, was completely different from the one that Luo Fan and the others had experienced. It might not be the era of divine path, but something else, such as the age of nirvana. Such a fact showed that no matter what situation Luo Fan and the others experienced, even if they were lucky enough to experience the first era after the end of days, everything that happened there was only one possibility after the end of days. It was impossible to deduce what had happened at the end of days, and even more impossible to deduce what their fate would be. It could be seen from this that Luo Fan and the others didn't find any traces of the end of days in the 8th era after the end of days. They didn't find anything they were familiar with, but it didn't mean that they couldn't live to that era, and it didn't even mean that the sages after the end of days didn't succeed in stopping the tide of the era. In other words, the history of these eras was only for reference, and didn't have much practical significance. When he understood this, Luo Fan felt his mind clear up. The obstacles that prevented him from comprehending the development of the Earth and the universe for hundreds of millions of years and the mysteries of the evolution of the eras instantly disappeared. Countless mysteries related to power emerged from the depths of his memories, continuously increasing his cultivation level. In the end, when he pushed his cultivation level to the peak of the 8th stage of Immortal Realm, and was only a step away from the 9th stage of Immortal Realm, he broke through the barrier, allowing him to comprehend the true meaning of annihilation. He saw through another layer of the deep truth of the universe, and became an annihilator. This process seemed very illusory, and it seemed extremely absurd. But it was reasonable. This was because in the depths of his mind, he always felt that these eras were of the same origin, and that there must be an extremely close connection between them. The existing contradictions must have been caused by some mistake on his part. As a result, he couldn't comprehend the information more deeply, and he couldn't comprehend the mysteries of power more deeply. When he understood that these eras were not directly related to each other and were relative, the various contradictions were naturally no longer contradictions. Naturally, he wouldn't feel conflicted. As he continued to comprehend, it would be a smooth journey without any obstacles. Naturally, his cultivation realm would be able to increase extremely quickly. Luo Fan stretched out his body and enjoyed the completely different world before him. With a slight thought, he understood where he was at the moment. He could even vaguely sense that this eras was the projection of tens of thousands of eras after the age of degeneration. He understood the characteristics of this eras even more clearly. There's actually an eras like this. This is quite a great opportunity. Luo Fan sighed leisurely, a faint smile appearing on his face. After becoming an annihilator, the power of his own abilities and the era's bridge were no longer that great of a difference. Although it was still inferior, it wasn't as incomprehensible as before. Because of this, he couldn't be like the treasure spirit of the era's bridge, easily knowing which eras were being projected, and what kind of characteristics the eras had. However, he could still have a general feeling. That was why he could sense those above with a slight sense. With a single thought, Luo Fan's aura was completely withdrawn. He raised his foot and strode through the air. Then, he arrived outside the room and met with the other Khanate Grand Luo cultivators. "Congratulations on your great improvement, Brother Luo." The martial emperor could not help but be overjoyed when he saw Luo Fan. "You're too kind, Brother Wu. I just obtained it by chance." Luo Fan smiled and said. The other Khanate Grand Luo cultivators had reacted by now, and they came forward to greet Luo Fan and congratulate Luo Fan on his great improvement. Although Luo Fan was many times stronger than before and could look at these Khanate Grand Luo cultivators as if they were ants, he did not feel arrogant at all. He greeted all of them one by one, and his behavior was no different than before he went into closed-door cultivation. The commotion caused by Luo Fan's exit from closed-door cultivation was too great. Not only did the living beings in the martial world sense it, even the other Khanate Grand Luo cultivators in the projection of the era of imagination outside the martial world sensed the change and guessed that Luo Fan had come out of closed-door cultivation. Therefore, these connate grand Luo cultivators came one after another to congratulate Luo Fan. After a while, everyone gathered in the martial world. It was rare for them to be gathered together. Fellow Taoist Luo Fan, since you're done with your closed-door cultivation, you should continue to pass the test. However, this era projection is really rare. Should we stay here for a while to gain more time? Old Man Omniscient asked. At this moment, Luo Fan's strength had already far exceeded the sum of everyone present by many times. Naturally, the dominant position would not fall on anyone else. Strength determined everything. Such a principle was the same in any world and level. Even connate grand Luo cultivators were no exception. Luo Fan faintly smiled and said, I can see that fellow Taoists' auras are still somewhat unstable at this time. Obviously, you still need time to digest what you have obtained from the previous round. I think it would be better to stay here for a while. Thank you for your understanding, fellow Taoist, said many connate grand Luo cultivators. Luo Fan naturally waved his hand to indicate that there was no need to be so courteous. He continued, I think the limit of the time flow of this era of imagination's projection isn't just 10,000 times faster. Why don't I imagine a world and exchange for a longer time flow? When the others heard that, they could not help but be shocked. A time flow of 10,000 times faster had already surpassed their imagination. If it was not for the characteristics of the era of imagination and the huge difference in the flow of time between the era bridge and the outside, they would not have imagined that they could have such a world. At this moment, when they heard Luo Fan say that this time flow was not the limit, and that it could still continue to grow, how could they not be shocked? After the shock, they became extremely curious. All of them wanted to know what this world with a time flow that was 10,000 times faster was like. Naturally, they agreed. To be continued. Chapter 850. Luo Fan smiled faintly and nodded at the martial monarch. Text first appeared. The martial monarch naturally knew what Luo Fan meant. With a thought, he dispersed the complete martial world in his imagination. As the martial world within the space of imagination dispersed, the projection of the age of imagination naturally dispersed as well. The martial world that numerous connate grand immortal realm cultivators had stayed in for 3,000 years had vanished without a trace in the blink of an eye. Many innate grand heavenly realm cultivators reappeared in the projection of the age of imagination. The flow of time in the space they were in had returned to the state on the bridge of time that was 10,000 times slower than the outside world. The huge difference made the expressions of the innate grand heavenly realm cultivators who had just entered the martial world change slightly, and they found it hard to accept. Luo Fan looked around with a faint smile on his face. With a slight thought, a three-layered world structure appeared in his imagination. The three-layered world structure consisted of a major kiliacosm, a medium kiliacosm, and a minor kiliacosm. Whether it was the major kiliacosm, the medium kiliacosm, or the minor kiliacosm, everything within them was perfect. It was as if these three worlds really existed. Everything seemed extremely real, and even the living beings within them were vivid as if they were living beings in the real world. The flow of time in the major kiliacosm was 365 times faster than that of the outside world. The flow of time in the medium kiliacosm was 365 times faster than that of the major kiliacosm, and the flow of time in the minor kiliacosm was 365 times faster than that of the age of imagination. In total, the flow of time in this minor kiliacosm was 48,627,125 times faster than the outside world, the projection of the fantasy era. Even if the flow of time on the bridge of time was 10,000 times slower than that of the outside world, it was still more than 4,000 times faster than that of the Earth universe in the outside world. At this moment, the power that defined the age of imagination naturally reacted. The power of the age of imagination naturally condensed, and the entire age of imagination began to surge. It seemed as if it could not bear it, and it began to tremble slightly. The condensed power started to construct a three-layered world around Luo Fan's body. 365 times the flow of time in the boundless universe, 365 times the flow of time in the boundless universe, 365 times the flow of time in the boundless universe, and 365 times the flow of time in the boundless universe. One layer on top of the other, perfecting the previous layer. Finally, when it was completely formed, the entire utopian era slowly calmed down, and a huge world that seemed to exist without any illusions appeared beside the core of the projection of the age of imagination. It was a three-layered world with a round sky and a square earth. Whether it was a major thousand world, a medium thousand world, or a minor thousand world, their world structure was completely different from Earth's universe. It was not a world of the universe, but a world with a round sky and a square earth. It was like a legendary world. "Fellow Taoists, please," Luo Fan said with a smile as he opened his eyes. At this moment, the other Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators were both shocked and curious. Naturally, they were shocked that Luo Fan was able to guide the power of the Age of Imagination to construct such a real world. This meant that the world he constructed in the space of his imagination had already reached a level that was close to the origin. His imagination was many times stronger than theirs. What they were curious about was whether the flow of time in this world was really as he said. It was a speed that was faster than the flow of time in the outside world. With a thought, everyone stepped into the colossal world through the entrance that Luo Fan had opened. As soon as they stepped in, they were slightly stunned. They were Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators, and their senses were extremely shocking. Naturally, they could feel the difference between the flow of time and the outside world as soon as they stepped in. They knew that the flow of time in this colossal world was only 365 times the flow of time in the outside world. However, they also knew that Luo Fan would not speak without thinking. There were definitely secrets that they had not discovered. After a careful look, they found a medium thousand world and stepped into it one after another. They felt that the flow of time was 365 times faster than the flow of time in the medium thousand world. Such a speed was over 130,000 times faster than the flow of time in the outside world, and it had far surpassed the martial world that the martial monarch had constructed. Even so, it could be considered as fulfilling his promise. However, it was obvious that there was another layer of world structure beneath this. When they understood this, everyone was extremely shocked, and they felt that the world in their eyes seemed to have been instantly overturned. How could this be possible? How could a world that was imagined be so perfect? Such thoughts reverberated in everyone's minds for a time, and it caused them to feel that Luo Fan was covered in a thick layer of fog. No matter what Tao the Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators cultivated, they definitely possessed the ability to distort time. It was just that the Tao they cultivated was different, and this ability varied in strength. For example, the Sky Maiden could see through the past, present, and future with a single glance, and observe it as if it was a flat surface. There were also others who could barely make the flow of time in the world they created slower or faster than the flow of time in the outside world by a few times. It was even to the extent that there were gods that Luo Fan had encountered in the past who could travel through the past and the future at will. It wasn't very difficult for everyone present to distort time. However, even if they possessed such an ability and imagined creating a world where time flowed faster and faster like this, they'd never realized it. The reason was none other than the fact that the Earth's universe couldn't endure the existence of such a world. The Earth's universe was completely different from the primitive world. The profundities of the Earth's universe were mostly concentrated on the trend of the times. The strength of the space there was countless times weaker than an ordinary perfect world, and it was utterly unable to endure the interweaving of the flow of time in the world. Therefore, even if such thoughts weren't a secret to them, they'd never really realized it. At most, they could only be limited to fantasizing about it. Obviously, even though connate golden immortal realm cultivators were peerlessly formidable, it was utterly impossible for them to construct a world that could be acknowledged by the projection of the era of imagination and be condensed with the might to create such a world if they hadn't established it or truly completed such a world. Not to mention making this world real, there was no need to even hope for that. But at this moment, Luo Fan was so relaxed. He'd imagined the structure that couldn't possibly exist in the Earth's universe and obtained the recognition of the era of imagination, condensing it into what it was in front of him. There was no illusion at all. It was as if the structure of the three-layered world that really existed in reality had appeared. How could they not be shocked and feel that it was unimaginable? Could it be that imagination could really achieve this? Such doubts gradually appeared in everyone's hearts. When they sensed it in the boundless world before, they already knew that this world had a three-layered structure. At this time, it was just a medium-class world, not the end. Naturally, they wouldn't stop here. They found the entrance to the spirit space again. With Luo Fan's guidance, they entered the spirit space. As soon as they entered, everyone didn't even have the mood to be shocked. Only a kind of numbness spread. It was 365 times faster. In total, the flow of time in this spirit space was more than 48 million times faster than the outside world. No matter how crazy a person was, they couldn't imagine that such a difference in the flow of time could actually appear. What else could they do in that situation? This place has 3 layers of structure and 3 different flows of time. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages. Fellow Taoists, you can choose your own place to cultivate. There's no need to stand on ceremony. Luo Fan's figure materialized in front of everyone and said, "Time flowed faster the deeper one went into the three-layered world. However, at the same time, the stability of the space was getting worse, and the origin chi was getting thinner. The structure of the rules and laws was also getting simpler. However, it wasn't all advantages. Many innate Grand Luo cultivated differently. Some needed a long time, while some needed dense origin chi. Some needed a stable space, while some needed complicated laws and laws. There were many of them, so they naturally couldn't be compared. Everyone naturally expressed their gratitude when they heard Luo Fan's words. Luo Fan looked at everyone and knew how shocked they were. He even felt a sense of fear towards himself. He smiled and didn't mind it. He said to the martial monarch, "Brother Wu, I've opened up a cave especially for you. Come with me." Although the martial emperor was shocked by Luo Fan's strength, he was not as fearful as the others. After hearing Luo Fan's words, he smiled and said, "That's great." With that, he didn't care about the others and took a step forward. He followed Luo Fan's guidance and arrived somewhere outside the three-layered world. It was a flat surface, and the surroundings were boundless nothingness. Below it, one could vaguely see the scenes of the major thousand world, medium thousand world, and spirit space. And Luo Fan was standing in front of him. This place combines the advantages of the three worlds. The flow of time is the fastest, and the stability of the space is the same as the major thousand world. The concentration of origin chi isn't any weaker, and you can easily comprehend the laws and laws of the three worlds. Brother Wu, you can cultivate without worry. Luo Fan smiled. The martial monarch was overjoyed when he heard that. He said, "It really is amazing. It's a holy land for cultivation." He didn't ask Luo Fan what to do with the others, or why he didn't let them come here. Because this was his friendship with Luo Fan, and not the friendship between the others and Luo Fan. If people with deep friendship were treated the same, then what was the point of friendship? Luo Fan nodded and sighed, "Brother Wu, just focus on cultivating. Because of me, you've lost many opportunities. I hope this can make up for your losses. With the relationship between us, there's no need to say all of this." The martial emperor smiled calmly and said. As he spoke, he sat down cross-legged and closed his eyes. He began to circulate the martial power in his body and comprehend the information he had obtained from the projection core in the Age of Destruction. Although he had maintained a portion of his focus on cultivation, he had to maintain the integrity of the martial world in his imagination space at all times, so he couldn't spare much energy. He couldn't focus on cultivating at all. Even now, he still couldn't completely absorb the information he had obtained. Now that there was an opportunity, he naturally wouldn't waste it. Seeing the martial monarch like this, Luo Fan smiled and also sat down cross-legged, slowly closing his eyes. He wasn't cultivating at the moment, but comprehending the mysteries of becoming an extinguisher. Although maintaining such an imagination space was somewhat stressful for him, it wasn't like the martial monarch, who could only spare a small amount of energy. After all, Luo Fan was an extinguisher, while the martial monarch's strength was only equivalent to the 9th stage of the immortal realm. Even his cultivation was only equivalent to the 7th stage of the immortal realm. His performance was obviously completely different. When Luo Fan's will clone stepped onto the bridge of the era, he completely comprehended the mysteries of the extinguisher. The moment he became an extinguisher, in the great thousand worlds on Earth, Luo Fan's main body, who had been sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed for millions of years, suddenly had a thought and woke up from the process of sorting out his worldview. I see. This is the extinguisher. He raised his eyes and looked around. There was an incomparably deep divine light in his eyes. Endless principles seemed to flash through the depths of his eyes in that instant. At this moment, the aura on his body was deep and unfathomable. Although it wasn't much stronger than before. But in essence, it was countless times more profound than before. His eyes swiveled. As his body moved, it was as if a complete world was moving, slowly waking up from a deep slumber. Evidently, the process of sorting out his worldview, which had lasted millions of years, wasn't completely successful at this moment, but he had already obtained indescribable benefits. Although there wasn't much improvement in his cultivation, his understanding of his future path was countless times clearer than before. Compared to the current him, the martial monarch who had just stepped onto the path of creating his own martial path was as weak as a baby crying piteously for food. To him, the martial monarch who had just stepped onto the bridge of the era was as weak as a baby crying piteously for food. Although his will clone had stepped onto the bridge of the era, it had almost completely cut off the connection between the clone and the main body. However, it was only an almost. The connection between the main body and the clone was inseparable. Although the separation of time and space made it impossible for him to clearly understand the various experiences of the clone. Some of the intrinsic changes that happened to the clone would still naturally be transmitted to the main body. For example, at this moment, he could sense the true meaning of extinguisher that the clone had comprehended without any reservations. In other words, the moment his clone became an extinguisher, Luo Fan's main body in this Earth universe also obtained a huge improvement at the same time and also became an extinguisher. This change. It wasn't strange. After all, the extinguisher realm required comprehension of a realm. As long as one comprehended that realm, they could instantly improve the essence of life. The life essence of the clone was connected to the main body. The improvement of the life essence of the clone would naturally lead to the improvement of the original body's life essence. In turn, it would also allow the original body to comprehend the true meaning of extinguisher. As long as the barrier between the clone and the main body wasn't as great as the barrier between the primordial world and the Earth universe, such an influence would not be severed or destroyed. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan's main body became an extinguisher at this moment. The mysterious existence that was invisible and intangible made it impossible to determine if it was real or not, caused Luo Fan's entire perspective and perception of the universe to undergo a huge change. The various mysteries that originally required many methods to be able to see were no longer obstructed at this moment. They directly appeared in front of Luo Fan's eyes, allowing him to grasp them extremely easily. In an instant, many of the shackles that originally prevented him from sorting out the complete world collapsed and disappeared. It made him feel that his mind was many times clearer, and the difficulty of sorting out his own world also seemed to decrease a lot. As he carefully sensed the mysteries of the extinguisher realm, Luo Fan's thoughts moved slightly. The entire major chiliocosm shook slightly, and the wind and clouds surged in an instant, as if an extremely intense change was occurring at the root. This change only subsided after a long time. At this moment, the entire major chiliocosm seemed to have not changed at all. However, as long as a connate zenith heaven cultivator came here, they would discover that the major chiliocosm was closer to a perfect world than before. The stability of the space, the combination of the laws, and the laws were much stronger than before. Even the many living beings in the major chiliocosm felt much more comfortable at this moment. Or, to be more precise, they felt that their surroundings seemed to be much more real. This change was not because of anything else. It was because after Luo Fan became an extinguisher, he suddenly discovered many imperfections in the structure of the major chiliocosm that he had never discovered before. Thus, with a thought, he modified the many imperfections and eliminated the changes that they caused. Although the many imperfections in the structure would not become flaws that shackled the development of the martial world like the martial world created by the martial emperor, they would still affect the growth of the major chiliocosm. After countless years, they might cause some shocking changes and some uncontrollable consequences. Naturally, they could not be allowed to exist. This is already the case for the extinguisher. It seems that the following void comprehending, Tao integration, transcendent, and even Tao masters will be even more mysterious and incredible. Luo Fan thought to himself, and a faint smile appeared on his face. He suddenly felt that it was an extremely wise decision for his mind doppelganger to step onto the era bridge. Even if the doppelganger failed in the end and could not really rush into the era vortex, the existence of the numerous checkpoints alone was enough to make up for the effort. Unfortunately, although I've become an extinguisher, I still have to sort out the world view bit by bit. It can't be done in one go. Luo Fan sighed again. After sighing, he did not waste any time and closed his eyes again. Countless thoughts appeared in his mind. Countless thoughts kept appearing and disappearing again. He was once again immersed in the process of sorting out his worldview that had been going on for millions of years. Although he had become an extinguisher and comprehended the true meaning of extinguishing, the essence of life had been greatly improved. But for the process of sorting out his worldview, it only made his thinking clearer, his perception sharper, and it was easier for him to sort it out. It did not allow him to surpass this process and directly complete the sorting out of the worldview. To be continued. Chapter 851. Text first published Baidu Search. Reading novels fastest updated. While his main body was once again immersed in the grand process of tidying up his worldview, Luo Fan's mental doppelganger was still inside the projection of the Age of Imagination, in the three-layered world that he had condensed from the projection of the Age of Imagination with his own imagination, quietly comprehending the mystery of entering perdition. The structure of the three levels of the world was naturally not like what the other innate golden immortal realm cultivators thought, and it was just the structure of the world that he imagined. In fact, it was one of the three worlds that Luo Fan had extracted from the structure of the limitless Void Palace. The Great Thousand World was the only Great Thousand World within the limitless Void Palace. The Medium Thousand World was one of the 3,000 Medium Thousand Worlds, and the Minor Thousand World was one of the 9 million Minor Thousand Worlds. It was because these worlds truly existed and were created by him. It was because of this that he had such a deep and complete understanding of these three worlds. That was why he could perfectly construct these three worlds in his imagination. However, it was also because of Luo Fan's high thinking ability that he could imagine this three-layered world so completely and condense such a real world with the projection of the utopian era. While cultivating, time passed quickly. After 100,000 years, Luo Fan finally awoke from the state of comprehending the mysteries of the realm of annihilation. The Destruction Realm was the starting point of the last 5 realms before the Saint Realm, and it was even to the extent that it allowed Golden Immortal Realm cultivators that had comprehended this realm to obtain an enormous improvement in the essence of their lives, so its profundities were obvious. Although 100,000 years was not a short period of time, it was only an extremely short period of time in the process of comprehension. Of course, with Luo Fan's ability, he had already gained a deep understanding of the profundities of the annihilation stage after spending 100,000 years. At this moment, the various profundities of the annihilation stage had already been used to the point of perfection, and there was no longer a trace of difficulty. On this day, when Luo Fan opened his eyes, he saw the martial monarch in front of him lifting his hands and feet, displaying an extremely exquisite martial art on the platform. The martial arts moves were wide open, and countless afterimages appeared around his body. These phantoms were not phantoms of his body, but phantoms of worlds. There were all kinds of strange worlds. Some were sinister, some were peaceful, some were balanced, and some were extreme. Each had its own mysteries, each had its own characteristics, and each had its own magical effect. In reality, these illusory worlds were not completely illusory. Instead, they existed between reality and illusion. When a martial monarch used a martial art, his martial arts would affect the surrounding space, naturally opening up an invisible world in the void. If these worlds were illusory, they would have the characteristics of a real world. If they were real, they would not be able to truly take form, unable to descend into the real world. Its profundity was almost indescribable in words. This flat surface was quite vast, but it was enough for a martial emperor to execute all kinds of martial arts. In an instant, countless profound and indescribably exquisite martial arts were continuously displayed in the martial monarch's hand. Every single one of his movements contained the mysteries of a supreme martial art, possessing the functions of a supreme martial art manual by ordinary martial artists. Under his usage, the surrounding rules and laws produced all sorts of strange distortions, changing into another profound characteristic. It was as if even the characteristics of the void were about to change along with it. With a thought, Luo Fan knew that the martial monarch's cultivation should have reached the 8th step of the immortal realm. His martial arts worldview must have improved greatly as well. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to display such a shocking effect with such ease. When Luo Fan opened his eyes, the martial monarch had already noticed his gaze. After performing another round of martial arts, he stopped and said, "Brother Luo has finally woken up. I've really been bored to death these past few years. Come and spar with me." Martial arts had already been developed into a supreme technique that led directly to the Grand Tao by the martial monarch. However, it was developed from battle after all, and it was fundamentally a cultivation technique related to battle. Even though the cultivation environment here was extremely wonderful, it was fine for a martial monarch to cultivate for a short period of time, but it was slightly inappropriate for him to cultivate for a long period of time. Because there was no opponent here. Or perhaps, not to mention this place, there was no opponent in the entire 3-layer world that Luo Fan had opened up that could be his opponent. Even though there were over 20 Golden Immortal Realm cultivators in this 3-layer world, they either didn't have much of a relationship with the martial monarch, or the gap between them was truly too great. It was great to the point that the martial monarch only had to slightly release his martial arts will to make them unable to arouse any thoughts of resistance. Under such circumstances, how could they be a match for the martial monarch? How could they allow the martial monarch to fight to his heart's content? It was precisely because of this that the martial monarch had been unable to find an opponent during these 100,000 years, and it was rather uncomfortable for him to be stifled. At this moment, when he saw that Luo Fan had woken up, even though he knew that the gap between him and Luo Fan was truly too great, and sparring with Luo Fan might be asking for trouble, under the circumstances that he'd almost gone mad from stifling himself, how could he care about all of this? So he naturally didn't care in the slightest as he challenged Qin Shi. At this moment, Luo Fan was slightly interested in the martial monarch's cultivation as well. So even though he knew that the gap between him and the martial monarch was too great, and sparring with the martial monarch wouldn't yield any good results, he still nodded with a smile and agreed to the martial monarch's request. When he saw Luo Fan nod in agreement, the martial monarch was overjoyed. After he warned Luo Fan to be careful, his figure flashed, and he instantly traversed a distance of over 10 m before his fist smashed directly towards Luo Fan's face. This punch of his seemed crude, but in fact it was indescribably exquisite. It seemed to contain all the mysteries of martial arts he had learned in his life. The rules and laws around this punch were directly changed by this punch, becoming one that was completely compatible with this punch. It endlessly increased the power of this punch and endlessly restricted all the power that could block it except for this punch. In an instant, Luo Fan even felt that the entire world, the entire earth, the universe, and even countless eras had erupted from this punch, and it covered the heavens and the earth as it pressed down towards him fiercely, intending to directly crush him into powder. In the face of this punch, Luo Fan instantly realized that his estimation of the martial monarch was still slightly off. The martial monarch's attainments in martial arts were much greater than he'd imagined. The might of this punch had obviously reached the limits of the 9th level of the immortal realm, and it only required a slight improvement before it would be able to surpass the 9th level of the immortal realm and possess the qualifications to comprehend the realm of annihilation. Of course, perhaps no other innate heavenly realm cultivators in this world would be able to resist such a punch, but it wasn't troublesome for Luo Fan. With a single thought, he raised his right hand, and he blocked the punch in a seemingly slow but actually swift manner. With a loud bang, the rules and laws in the surroundings instantly collapsed and were obliterated. Space instantly shattered into boundless spatial powder, and a formless and colorless mist was created that spread towards the surroundings. The surroundings had turned into nothingness along with this change. The nothingness grew larger and larger, and it gradually seeped into the plane below, causing the plane to shatter as well. As the plane shattered, Luo Fan and the martial monarch fell into the minor kiliacosm. The light and shadow in the surroundings changed, and it wasn't the scene of nothingness from before any longer. Instead, it was a boundless world that was filled with vitality and the aura of boundless living beings. At this moment, there were over 10 innate heavenly realm cultivators cultivating in this minor kiliacosm. The aftershock of the battle between Luo Fan and the martial monarch was so shocking, so it was naturally impossible for it to escape their senses. Thus, at the instant that Luo Fan and the martial monarch fell into this minor kiliacosm, over 10 strands of will swept towards them. However, even though their will was practically omnipotent in the outside world, it was still weak to the point of being difficult to deal with when compared to Luo Fan and the martial monarch. They were utterly unable to exist in the aftershock of their battle, and they were instantly shattered by the aftershock created by the punch and palm, causing them to be utterly unable to see exactly how the battle between Luo Fan and the martial monarch was like. The battle that couldn't be seen clearly was only the battle between the martial monarch and Luo Fan in this 3-layered world. So, even though they couldn't see it clearly, all the innate heavenly realm cultivators in this minor kiliacosm instantly understood what had happened, and they hurriedly left this minor kiliacosm to descend into the dimensional world above, yet they were afraid of being affected by the aftershock of their battle. The battle between Luo Fan and the martial monarch naturally wouldn't stop because of their reactions. Even though the flat surface had been broken, the martial emperor still didn't care. His hands and feet moved together, and his figure was like a swimming dragon, bypassing a mysterious trajectory. He used all kinds of exquisite and indescribable martial arts that were enough to make any martial artist bow down to him, crazily attacking Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan seemed to deal with these attacks with ease. He seemed to be extremely relaxed, yet actually contained boundless profundities as he constantly blocked these attacks. Although the power of their attacks was extremely restrained, and they didn't waste a single bit of their power on destroying the outside world, when their power blasted out, it would naturally destroy the surrounding space and the laws in space. As a result, the heavens and the earth naturally reacted, causing the world to overturn and shake. The strength of the space in this minor kiliacosm was naturally far inferior to the plane where the martial monarch and Luo Fan were. During the battle, the entire minor kiliacosm quickly shattered. Countless spatial fragments, spatial powder, and law fragments mixed together to form an increasingly large sphere. It grew larger and larger in the minor kiliacosm, and the area it occupied grew wider and wider. In the end, after a few minutes, it finally grew to a certain limit, and the entire minor kiliacosm instantly collapsed. The minor kiliacosm was formed by attaching itself to the dimensional world. When the minor kiliacosm was destroyed, Luo Fan and the martial monarch naturally fell into the dimensional world. There were many innate grand Luo cultivators in the dimensional world to begin with. Coupled with the cultivators who escaped from the minor kiliacosm, there were already over 20 innate grand Luo cultivators here. The innate grand Luo cultivators who escaped from the minor kiliacosm were already experienced. When they saw the changes, they immediately knew what was going on. They quickly left the dimensional world and entered the great kiliacosm outside. As for the innate grand Luo cultivators who did not enter the minor kiliacosm, due to their lack of experience, they extended their consciousnesses to the place where Luo Fan and the martial monarch were fighting. Clearly, the outcome was no surprise to them. Their consciousnesses were also destroyed, and their minds were greatly impacted. At this moment, they finally understood why the fellow Taoists who came out of the minor kiliacosm fled the dimensional world without any hesitation. They smiled bitterly and chased after their fellow Taoists, leaving the dimensional world. At this moment, the martial monarch was already in high spirits. The might of Luo Fan's divine ability was tens of thousands of times stronger than his. No matter what technique or martial art he used, he could unleash his full power, and Luo Fan could easily block it. No matter what martial art he used, he could easily find its flaws and break it in an instant. Under such circumstances, he didn't have to worry about being too heavy-handed. He could perfectly display all the martial arts he had comprehended in his life and display his exploration of the great way of martial arts without holding back. For him, who had been holding back for a long time, how could there be anything more delightful than this? It was precisely because of this satisfaction that he did not care about anything else. He did not hold back his power at all, and the destruction he caused to the surroundings was also so great. This three-layered world was not created with the help of Luo Fan's power, but a projection of the Age of Utopia. It was created by Luo Fan's imagination. To Luo Fan, it was only a figment of his imagination. As long as he wanted, he could recreate it in just a few breaths of time. Naturally, he did not feel the slightest pain at the destruction of this world. He did not control the aftermath of the battle, and he did not waste his energy to maintain the integrity of this world. If it had been a real battle, the martial emperor would not have been able to display so many martial arts in front of Luo Fan. As long as he attacked, Luo Fan would be able to completely disintegrate his martial arts in an instant and completely obliterate his existence. However, at this moment it was a spar to feel the martial emperor's strength, and also to let the martial emperor enjoy the fun of fighting. Therefore, Luo Fan did not take the initiative to attack. Instead, he attacked according to the move. With the help of the supreme magic he had obtained after becoming an exterminator, he used the simplest and most direct method to easily disintegrate all of the martial emperor's attacks. In a situation where there were no restrictions on their power, the dimensional world was soon unable to withstand their battle. Half a day later, a similar process occurred in the dimensional world. A sphere formed from various fragments finally expanded to the limit of the dimensional world. In the end, with a loud bang, the dimensional world was completely destroyed. Luo Fan and the martial monarch fell into the last of the vast thousand world. When the innate Grand Luo, who had left the vast thousand worlds, saw that Luo Fan and the martial monarch were fighting, they knew that it would be useless even if they tried to stop them. Therefore, even the innate Grand Luo, who had been in the vast thousand worlds and had not sensed the power of the aftermath of the battle between Luo Fan and the martial monarch, had wisely chosen to leave the vast thousand world. They did not want to check on the situation of the battle between the two. The space, rules, and laws of the great thousand worlds were much more stable than that of the dimensional and minor world. Thus, the time that the great thousand worlds withstood the battle between Luo Fan and the martial monarch was much longer than that of the dimensional world. It was a full 3 days and 3 nights before the shockwaves of their battle caused it to collapse. After the vast thousand worlds collapsed, Luo Fan and the martial monarch naturally appeared in the projection of the Age of Imagination, standing beside the core of the projection of the Age of Imagination. Although the battle between Luo Fan and the martial monarch was so intense, Luo Fan was able to deal with it with ease. Therefore, he was extremely clear about the changes in the surroundings. At this moment, when they appeared in the projection of the Age of Imagination, he knew that the sparring had come to an end. That was because if this continued, it would affect the core of the projection of the Age of Imagination, inciting an intense resistance from the entire Age of Imagination. The two of them would be violently rejected by the entire Age of Imagination, resulting in unpredictable consequences. This was nothing to Luo Fan at this moment. It would only take him a little effort. But for the martial monarch, it would be rather troublesome. Therefore, with a thought from Luo Fan, the power in his body surged, instantly dispelling the blazing attack of the martial monarch. This caused the martial monarch's originally fanatical thoughts to clear up, and only then did he notice the changes in the surroundings. When he saw that the surroundings were already pitch black, and that Taoist Heaven Flame and the others were far away, not daring to approach, he understood where he was. With a thought, he recalled how the minor thousand worlds, medium thousand worlds, and the vast thousand worlds were destroyed. He couldn't help but feel slightly ashamed. He withdrew his hand and stood solemnly. He said, "I lost my composure for a moment. I hope you won't blame me." No, it doesn't matter if we change places. On the other hand, it's quite a pity that the world created by fellow Luo Fan is destroyed just like that. The Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators couldn't say anything else. They could only say this. That's nothing. It's just a world. As long as I haven't lost my imagination, the projection of the Age of Imagination will naturally help me create it. Luo Fan smiled when he saw the martial monarch reveal an ashamed expression. However, there's no need for that. We've already wasted some time in the projection of the Age of Imagination. I see that all of you seem to have finished sorting out all your gains. Why don't we destroy the projection of the Age of Imagination today? Luo Fan changed the topic and smiled. Perhaps some of the Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators felt that it was beneficial to stay here for a long time. However, most of them were just like Luo Fan had said. They'd already finished sorting out all their gains from entering the Bridge of Time. Even if they stayed here for a long time, they wouldn't have any more gains. The discussion between the Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators was naturally not completely democratic, but it was still in line with the interests of the majority after all. Thus, as soon as Luo Fan spoke, even the Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators, who felt that it was better to stay here for a period of time, could only nod with a smile and express their agreement. Registered members can obtain private benefits. Chapter 891 Sparring Again. Chapter 852. Luo Fan could naturally tell that some of the cultivators were insincere, but he did not have the mood to care about them. He merely made an inviting gesture towards the martial emperor. The martial emperor naturally understood Luo Fan's intentions. He smiled and took a step forward, arriving before the others to personally face the core of the projection of the Age of Imagination. The core of the projection of the Age of Imagination was a strange void. It was dotted with countless tiny specks of light. They were densely packed, like mist of light that filled every region of the strange void. The innate zenith heavenly realm cultivators present could tell that it was a strange universe with a single glance. It contained the origin characteristics of the Age of Imagination. The universe was all-encompassing, and the imaginations of all living beings could be found within. The martial emperor had long since studied the core of the projection of the Age of Imagination. At that moment, he did not hesitate at all. With a slight thought, he took a step forward and entered the core. Although he had sparred with Luo Fan for a few days and nights, and even destroyed the three-layered world that Luo Fan had imagined, he did not consume much of his energy. In the time it took to exchange a few words, he had already completely recovered to his peak state. This was the extraordinary aspect of innate zenith heavenly realm cultivators. Pure energy expenditure was insignificant to innate zenith heavenly realm cultivators. As long as their origins were not damaged, they could recover in a breath's time. After the martial emperor entered the core of the projection of the Age of Imagination, he suddenly trembled. He raised his hands high, and as his body trembled, an indescribable wave spread out from his body. Everything around him quickly collapsed under the wave, and the entire universe that gathered the imaginations of all living beings within the projection of the Age of Imagination quickly collapsed. The speed of the collapse was unimaginably fast. In an instant it swept through every region of the core universe, including everything within it. At that moment the entire Utopia era trembled violently. Boundless imaginations gathered from all over the universe, crashing into the core and forming millions of demon gods around the martial emperor. These demon gods were all powerful, ugly, ferocious, and cruel things that could be imagined by living beings. After these demon gods appeared, they attacked the martial emperor without hesitation. Countless forces instantly drowned the martial monarch. At this moment, the power of the martial monarch's divine ability had already reached the peak of the ninth order of the celestial realm, so he was already prepared for these attacks. When the boundless attacks came within a meter of him, they were naturally devoured by an invisible existence and disappeared without a trace. They couldn't affect the martial monarch at all. At this moment, the martial emperor's raised hands seemed to be slowly pressing down. It was as though he was holding something unbelievably huge in his hands. His movements were incomparably slow. The muscles on his body bulged, and the martial power in his body surged. In the process of his actions, the entire core was finally overwhelmed. Countless cracks filled the entire core, and they grew larger and larger. In the end, the entire core completely collapsed. The entire process seemed to take a lot of time, but in reality, when the entire core collapsed, the imagination that had gathered from all directions in the fantasy era had yet to completely condense into the demon gods, and the attacks of the demon gods had yet to be completely unleashed. Only a small portion of the attacks of the demon gods had been devoured by the strange martial arts that the martial emperor had executed. In other words, this process was so fast that it exceeded the reaction of the Age of Imagination. Although the martial monarch had destroyed the core of the Age of Imagination projection, he hadn't completely withstood its resistance. He hadn't been able to completely absorb the unbelievably powerful attack. Because of this, although the martial monarch had withstood the attack, he hadn't been heavily injured. However, his face had paled slightly, and the martial power around him had suddenly become indescribably heavy. With the destruction of the core, endless information descended on the martial monarch's mind. In an instant, the martial monarch was drowned in the endless information, and he involuntarily fell into a deep sleep. This is the 400th stage, the 69,582 eras after the Age of Chaos. At that time, it will be known as the Formless Era. The method to pass the stage is to break the era. At the same time, the words of the treasure spirit of the Age Bridge came from the void. However, the martial monarch could no longer hear it. When the other connate Zenith Heaven cultivators heard the voice, they also noticed the martial monarch's current state, and they couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. However, their feelings were rather complicated. The might of the divine ability that the martial monarch revealed when sparring with Luo Fan had far exceeded their imagination, and it caused them to have an unprecedented feeling of how formidable the martial monarch, who usually didn't seem to be much stronger than them, was. This caused them to start to worry. If the martial monarch was as relaxed as Luo Fan after destroying the core of the projection, then they would have to start re-evaluating the gap between them and the martial monarch. However, at this moment, the martial monarch was still the same as before, or perhaps it should be said that he was still the same as them. This caused them to feel that the gap between them and the martial monarch wasn't as huge as they'd imagined, and this naturally caused them to heave a sigh of relief. As soon as this feeling of relief appeared, some existences that were extremely sensitive to their own abilities suddenly felt slightly embarrassed. They'd already felt the gap between them and the martial monarch a long time ago, yet they actually wanted to find all sorts of excuses to comfort themselves at this moment. This was simply deceiving themselves, so how could they not feel embarrassed? Luo Fan didn't care about what they thought. With a command in his mind, the world within his sleeve enveloped the martial monarch, and he placed the martial monarch within it. At this moment, the martial monarch had fallen into the boundless information, and he seemed as if he was in a state of deep slumber. So, he naturally needed a stable place to cultivate properly. Fellow Taoists, take care of yourselves. After he put the martial monarch away, Luo Fan smiled lightly to the others. The others naturally didn't dare be disrespectful, and they repeatedly said, "Take care." Luo Fan nodded. With a command in his mind, he'd entered the energy vision, and his figure transformed into void as he fused into nothingness. When the other connate Zenith Heaven cultivators saw Luo Fan vanish, they glanced at each other, and then they either sighed or smiled before they dispersed. Time passed by slowly, and in the blink of an eye, 300 years had passed. During these 300 years of time, the numerous First Heaven Golden Immortal Realm cultivators that had stepped foot onto the bridge of the times had arrived at the end of the 3,333rd barrier, or in other words, the core of the 3,333rd era projection. In these 300 years, they'd passed through a total of over 2,900 barriers, and they'd passed through an average of 10 barriers every single year. Moreover, every single barrier took around a month on average. This speed, compared to the beginning, was clearly unimaginably fast. Among the more than 2,900 checkpoints, there were more than 2,800 checkpoints where Luo Fan was the first to find the core of the era projection. As for the remaining dozens of checkpoints, other cultivators, either because they were lucky or because they were truly compatible with the era, were able to find the core of the era projection before Luo Fan. On the other hand, the martial emperor hadn't fallen into deep slumber for long at the 3,999th barrier, and it was only around 10 years. However, when he awoke, Luo Fan had already led numerous connate Zenith Heaven cultivators to the 500th barrier. After that, Luo Fan recalled how the martial emperor had given up so many opportunities to protect him, and he'd given the opportunity to destroy the core of the era projection to the martial emperor. The martial emperor knew that this was Luo Fan's intention, so he didn't refuse and took the responsibility to go forward and destroy the core before falling into deep slumber. Just like that, every time the martial emperor awoke, Luo Fan would give him the opportunity to destroy the core of the era projection. At this point, the martial emperor had already destroyed over 50 cores of the era projection. During these 300 years, he'd probably only been awake for a few days. Apart from the martial emperor, the other Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators weren't as lucky. Some had deep friendships, and some had shallow friendship. Naturally, Luo Fan wouldn't treat them the same, but he didn't care about them. Unless they found the core of the era projection first, he would definitely not give them the opportunity. The 3333rd barrier was the 7,573,268th era after the end of days, and it was called the Era of Saints by the people of that time. This era could be said to be the most troublesome era among the 3,333rd barrier that the Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators had experienced after they stepped onto the era bridge. That was because the era projection had become extremely real, and some of the living beings projected were even existences that weren't inferior to Luo Fan at all. Although they hadn't comprehended the true meaning of extinction, their strength was already comparable to the exterminators. Those existences were the reason why this era was named, and they were respected as saints by countless living beings on Earth. These saints weren't cultivators who cultivated the golden core path, but were naturally powerful beings. They were living beings that gained sentience and grew up in some special river systems in Earth's universe. This kind of creature, because it was born from the river system, had infinite energy and contained infinite knowledge. These two limitless abilities were enough to make them invincible, allowing them to look down on all Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators, and allow them to completely wipe out any Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators. Although there weren't many of these saints, there were still dozens of them. They were scattered all over Earth's universe, observing all changes in the universe in an extremely natural manner, adjusting the direction of development of the countless habitable planets in the universe, and controlling their future. Existences of this level existed in the previous barrier and the era projection as well. However, they were only simple projections in the previous era projection. Although they were still powerful, they were limited to the projection, and it was difficult to discover Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators like Luo Fan who had entered the era projection. However, in the era projection of the saints, the situation was completely different. These saints were completely no different from reality. When Luo Fan and the others broke through the previous era projection and entered the era projection of the saints, they were discovered by these saints. After some probing, they discovered Luo Fan's objective, and knew that Luo Fan and the others were here to destroy the universe they lived in. For a time, boundless hostility was born, and countless attacks of all kinds rained down on Luo Fan and the others. If Luo Fan wasn't already a destroyer, and his life essence was slightly higher than theirs, allowing him to resist their attacks, there might not be many Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators left now. Even so, all of these Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators were injured, and all of them seemed rather haggard and weak. At this moment, while the Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators had relied on Luo Fan's extraordinary understanding of the era projection to find the core of the era projection, the saints had discovered the core as well, and they'd gathered before the core to obstruct Luo Fan and the others. "We won't let you devils from another world destroy our universe." An old man who had white hair and a ruddy complexion, wore a long robe, and emanated an aura of boundless wisdom spoke sternly. The core of the era projection didn't exist in their memories. After all, they were only projections of true saints. Although they had boundless memories, they were born at the same time the era projection of the saints was projected over by the era bridge. Their memories were still limited to the true saints, so the core of the era projection, the unique profound existence of the era projection, was naturally completely unfamiliar to them. That was why they hadn't stood guard by the side of the core, and they'd waited for Luo Fan to arrive with the Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators before they could barely stand in front of the saints. The reason why they'd fought desperately to stop Luo Fan and the others despite being completely unfamiliar with the core was because when these saints with boundless knowledge laid eyes on the core, they'd instantly sensed that the core was related to the safety of their universe and era. If the core was destroyed, then the entire universe, the entire era, and all living beings would be instantly destroyed and completely vanish. Even saints like them wouldn't be able to meet any mishaps. Devils from another world, huh? I never thought there'd be a day when I'd be addressed like that. Luo Fan smiled when he heard the old man's words. There were a total of 36 saints in front of him. Every single one of them was as strong as he was. Apart from the fact that their life essence was lacking, they were not much different from the exterminators. The 36 of them hovered in the air, as if there were 36 exterminators hovering in the air. On Luo Fan's side, besides Luo Fan being an Terminator, the others, including the strongest martial emperor, were only equivalent to the 9th order of the immortal realm. The others were only around the 8th order of the immortal realm. Be it in terms of numbers or strength, they were far inferior to the martial emperors. How could the martial emperors and the others have an easy time facing such a contrast in strength? At this moment, all of their expressions were solemn. They'd already raised all sorts of energy in their bodies, and were ready to attack at any time. Existences that desire to destroy the universe are naturally devils. The old man's expression was solemn. The divine light that shot out from his eyes could almost pierce through space as he spoke indifferently. Do you know what form you're in right now? Luo Fan shook his head and asked. No matter what form we're in, this universe is our home. The old man didn't answer Luo Fan's question. Looks like you've already discovered that you're just projections, Luo Fan said in realization. So what if we're projections? It doesn't matter if we're projections or real bodies. As long as we have our own consciousness, we're absolutely real. Projections or real bodies, the only difference is the carrier. It doesn't matter at all. The old man wasn't shaken by Luo Fan's words at all. The other 35 saints were of different heights, and their figures were completely different, but they all had calm expressions on their faces. They were not moved by Luo Fan's words at all. It was obvious that they already knew what Luo Fan had said. As expected of a saint, this kind of temperament cultivation is really admirable. Luo Fan saw this and finally gave birth to a kind of admiration. He sighed. The martial emperors and the others listened to the conversation between Luo Fan and the old man, but shock gradually appeared on their faces. Even though they were first heaven golden immortals, their mental state and cultivation couldn't compare to these saints. They were unable to imagine how they would react if they noticed that they were only an illusory image one day. However, they knew that no matter what their reaction was, they wouldn't be indifferent like these saints, and they wouldn't be completely indifferent to whether their existence was illusory or real like these saints. Moreover, that wasn't the only thing that shocked them. It wasn't just one saint, but a total of 36 saints. This had truly exceeded their imagination. What a pity! I really want to see your real bodies. Luo Fan sighed after he praised them. Although he admired the mental cultivation of these saints, he didn't change his decision. He didn't give up on destroying the projection of this era. The projection of this era might be real to these saints, but it was just a projection to him. It was a barrier that he had to pass, a projection that he had to destroy. His decision to head to the era vortex hadn't wavered. His decision to destroy the projection of this era couldn't be changed. No matter what was here, no matter how much he admired these saints, it wouldn't change his decision. As expected, your demonic heart is firm and unshakable. The old man had obviously guessed that Luo Fan wouldn't give up. As he said this, the 36 saints shouted softly. The aura around them skyrocketed and interweaved together. It caused the entire earth, the universe, and the entire era of the saints to tremble subtly. As it trembled, an indescribable repulsive force acted on Luo Fan and the other innate golden heavenly realm cultivators. It made them feel as if the entire universe was disgusted with them and was preparing to crush them. Registered members can receive private benefits. Chapter 892. The Great Primitive Text. Chapter 853. Luo Fan's expression remained unchanged when facing such pressure, and threads of an extremely formidable aura gradually arose from his body. These threads of aura were naturally not for the sake of suppressing those 36 saints. Every single one of those 36 saints possessed strengths that weren't inferior to the Terminator, and they'd released their auras without holding back at all. As the Terminator, how could Luo Fan possibly rely on just these threads of aura to completely suppress their auras? Actually, these threads of aura were merely protecting him and allowing him to avoid being suppressed by the auras of those 36 saints. Even though these threads of aura were far inferior to the auras of those 36 saints in terms of quantity, they were extremely formidable in the end. They were superior to the auras of those saints. So, even though it was just a thread of them, it was already capable of isolating the effects of the auras of those saints. Luo Fan was able to isolate the auras of those saints with such ease, but the Martial Emperor and the others weren't so lucky, or perhaps it should be said that they didn't possess such strength. Amidst these auras, the feeling that the entire universe was rejecting them, detesting them, and wanting to crush them grew stronger and stronger. After a few breaths of time, it caused them to arouse a form of indescribable terror, and they started to firmly believe in this feeling. In an instant, the energy within their bodies surged, and the glow of treasures shot into the sky from their bodies. They hadn't just circulated their strength to the limits, they'd even utilized their magic treasures. All of these connate golden immortals had lived for at least a few billion years. Even if they weren't skilled in refining magic treasures, such a long period of time was sufficient for them to refine magic treasures at the perfection grade. So, every single one of these connate golden immortals naturally possessed magic treasures at the perfection grade. These magic treasures weren't of much use at any ordinary time, or perhaps it should be said that they weren't very useful when searching for the core of the era projection. But at this moment, when they sensed that the entire universe and the entire era was rejecting them, detesting them, and might crush them at any moment, how could they possibly maintain their composure? So, they naturally summoned everything they could rely on. At this moment, the auras of those saints had fused together to form an extremely formidable whole. Their minds and consciousnesses were linked together, and they seemed like a supreme entity that had been elevated. They looked at the numerous connate golden immortal realm cultivators before them with calm expressions, and their eyes were filled with resolution. The cultivation of these saints had reached an inconceivable level, and they did not lack the spirit of sacrifice. In the face of Luo Fan, who seemed like a demon from another world who wanted to destroy the world, they had completely abandoned their own lives. Even if they had to pay with their lives, they had to stop Luo Fan and the others. The power of a saint-level existence's divine ability had already reached an inconceivable level. To say that he is omnipotent is not an exaggeration. However, a battle did not require omnipotence. Instead, it required great destructive power. Hence, even though they were almost omnipotent in the Age of Saints, they could not use this omnipotence to subdue Luo Fan. They could only use their own strength to fight against Luo Fan. As for the other connate golden immortal realm cultivators, even though they paid attention to them as well, they mostly took them to be subordinates of Luo Fan, and they didn't really take them seriously. After all, with their ability, those 20-plus natural immortal realm golden immortal realm cultivators only required a few thoughts to be instantly suppressed and completely crushed. This was something that could be discerned from the numerous natural immortal realm golden immortal realm cultivators being unable to endure the pressure emanated by their auras. As soon as the consciousness of these saints acted, the surroundings instantly surged, and the heavens and the earth instantly changed. In a daze, it wasn't the appearance of the cosmos from before any longer, and it was a strange place where multicolored lights flickered and a myriad of strange colors were interweaved together. Here, space, time, laws, and everything else had been warped to an unimaginable extent, and all of them were mixed together to form an extremely strange characteristic. Boundless suction force emanated from the surroundings and acted on every single existence that entered this strange place, and it intended to pull everything into an unknown abyss. As soon as he stepped foot into this place, Luo Fan instantly understood what this place was, and he couldn't help but smile lightly. A black hole. Even if it's 1,000,000 times larger or stronger than an ordinary black hole, it's impossible for it to affect me at all. Of course, we don't intend to use this black hole to destroy you. Our objective is them. Meanwhile, a voice resounded from the void and entered Luo Fan's ears. This voice didn't belong to any saint, but it contained the characteristics of all saints. Obviously, it was the voice of the consciousness of the 36th saint. This place was indeed the interior of a black hole. However, this black hole was 1,000,000 times larger and stronger than any black hole that Luo Fan had seen in the past. Because of that, its essence had undergone some sort of miraculous change, and that was why such a scene had appeared. The 36 saints were within the black hole as well. Ordinary living beings relied on light to observe things, while stronger cultivators relied on their senses to observe things. Light and senses had been warped to an unimaginable extent within the black hole. Therefore, ordinary living beings and cultivators were unable to see the scene within the black hole, and thus, they were unable to see the 36 saints. Perhaps it wasn't that they were unable to see them, because they had indeed seen them. However, the figures they saw had been warped to the extreme by the black hole, so even if they saw them, they wouldn't be able to tell that they were the 36 saints. Even connate golden immortals weren't immune to such an effect. If this was an ordinary black hole, then the effect it had on connate golden immortals naturally wouldn't be strong, and they just had to utilize some divine abilities to isolate themselves from the effect and see everything within the black hole with extreme clarity. But it was obvious that this black hole was countless times stronger than an ordinary black hole, and the gravitational force within it had warped the laws and laws into a mess. So, how could it possibly be isolated by connate golden immortals with such ease? Under such circumstances, their display wasn't much different from ordinary living beings, and they weren't able to see where the 36 saints were at all. The martial monarch was the strongest existence amongst the numerous connate golden immortals. Moreover, he cultivated in the Tao of martial techniques, so the strength of his body and will reigned supreme over numerous connate golden immortals. So, he was able to see much more clearly than the other connate golden immortals. He could vaguely see 36 fixed figures floating before them, and their positions were exactly the same as when they were outside the black hole. The martial monarch cultivated was a Tao of his own, and he very rarely relied on external forces. The only magic treasure he possessed was the martial treasure scripture that he'd refined under Luo Fan's reminder. However, this magic treasure was a treasure of inheritance, and it wasn't a treasure of slaughter. It was even to the extent that it was only at the longevity grade, so it was naturally useless. So, when the other connate golden immortals summoned their perfected grade magic treasures, he didn't do so. Instead, he utilized a defensive martial technique to summon countless laws and laws out of thin air, and they weaved into an extremely profound shape above his head to form an extremely abstract martial character. This martial character wasn't a character that ordinary living beings could recognize, and it was a character that was directly extracted from the Grand Tao and reached the quintessence of martial technique. Even though it was still extremely incomplete and damaged, the might of its divine ability was already more formidable than ordinary perfected grade magic treasures. It was exactly because of this that the martial monarch had summoned it at that time. After they entered the black hole, the powerful auras emanated by the 36 saints were similarly warped by the black hole, and they were unable to produce any deterrent effects. the martial character instantly changed, and it directly changed from resisting the pressure of the aura to resisting the boundless pulling force in the surroundings. This change was extremely swift, and it was practically instinctive. It appeared at the moment the aura was warped and the boundless pulling force was formed in the surroundings. Because of this change, a strand of profound light instantly descended from the martial character, and it instantly enveloped the martial monarch. It caused the martial monarch's figure to instantly become illusory, and he naturally isolated himself from the influence of the pulling force in the surroundings. Besides the martial monarch, the other connate golden immortals didn't react as quickly as the martial monarch. At the instant they entered the black hole, the perfected grade magic treasures were utterly unable to react in time, and they let out shrill cries while the glow of their treasures dimmed at a visible rate. During the short period of time that Luo Fan and the saint's consciousness exchanged words, they'd already become extremely dispirited, and they seemed to be on the verge of collapsing completely and vanishing into nothingness. When the martial monarch saw that Luo Fan didn't make any movements to change this situation, he instantly understood Luo Fan's thoughts. With a command in his heart, he raised his hand and grabbed towards his fellow Taoists. This grab of his contained the supreme profundities of martial arts and countless profundities, and it directly carried the profundities of the heavens and the earth within it. In an instant, it passed through the warped space and acted on the 20+ connate golden immortals. Even though this move of the martial monarch was similarly an external force to the numerous connate golden immortals, they knew the martial monarch very well after all. They knew that it was the martial monarch who executed this move, so they didn't resist and allowed the force to act on them. The martial emperor suddenly retracted his right hand, and then those connate golden immortal realm cultivators instantly transformed into nothingness. Along with this retraction, they were easily drawn over a rather long distance to arrive before the martial emperor, and then they entered the space that the martial emperor had opened up. I never expected that the martial Tao would actually undergo such a change. Even though both of you are devils from another world, you still have some redeeming qualities, said the saint's consciousness. The changes in the surroundings grew more and more intense, and the pulling force and distorting force that acted on Luo Fan and the martial monarch grew stronger and stronger. However, at this moment, no matter how these forces changed, they were unable to change the actions of Luo Fan and the martial monarch. To a martial emperor, these changes were still within the scope of martial art. They were like a cultivator attacking him. As long as he countered the attacks, he would naturally be able to avoid the strong points and strike at the weak point. If he blocked these attacks, he would naturally be able to block these attacks. In fact, this was the true use of the word martial. At this moment, even though the distorting force and pulling force had become much stronger, it still hadn't exceeded his limits, and it was still within the scope that he could deal with. As for Luo Fan, the simple pulling force and distorting force were both forces, and he cultivated the Tao of strength. The force within his body was close to the source of strength, and he'd comprehended the numerous profundities of these two forces a long time ago. At this moment, when these forces were used to attack him, he only had to think about it slightly, and the energy within his body would surge slightly, and he would naturally be able to counteract it. It was 100 times easier than the martial monarch. Floating in the boundless light and shadow, it was as if he was floating in the void of the universe. There was nothing unusual at all, as if the endless pulling force and distorting force around him did not exist at all. Even the saints were unable to distinguish this change. They only thought that it was a special ability that a powerful Terminator like Luo Fan had. It was precisely because they did not understand this change that they did not react to Luo Fan's response. Instead, they praised the martial monarch's response. The conflict between Luo Fan and these saints was irreconcilable. Everyone knew this very well. Thus, Luo Fan did not waste any more words. With a thought, the power within his body, which was close to the source of strength, trembled slightly. In an instant, a distorted force field instantly formed, and an empty area with a circumference of 30 feet appeared around his body. This area of nothingness was extremely mysterious. It directly isolated all matter and power within the black hole. Even the laws and laws had completely disappeared. After that, countless fine and dense laws and laws stretched out from within Luo Fan's body, and they instantly covered the area of nothingness in the surroundings. These laws and laws were completely different from the laws and laws within the black hole in the surroundings. They were extremely harmonious and normal, and they were completely the same as the laws and laws from the end of days. This was something that Luo Fan had comprehended from the various characteristics of the perfect grade magic treasures. Perfect grade magic treasures possessed the characteristic of replacing the laws and laws of the outside world with the laws and laws they emanated. This characteristic allowed them to gain a great advantage in even the most dangerous of environments, and it was capable of isolating a great deal of harm. Even the perfect grade magic treasures that numerous connate golden immortals had utilized earlier possessed such a characteristic. The reason why it was ineffective was very simple. It was because the laws and laws in the surroundings had warped to a degree that exceeded the limits of what these perfect grade magic treasures could endure. Thus, it caused them to be unable to bring forth their might, and they were unable to keep their masters unharmed. They had to rely on the martial monarch to protect their masters. The reason why Luo Fan possessed the same ability was very simple. In his eyes, laws and laws were also formed from energy, or rather, they were energy. Since they were energy, he could naturally easily imitate them. He could naturally cover his entire body with it, and replace the extremely chaotic laws and laws within the black hole in the surroundings to form a complete domain. As for why he was not unable to endure it like the perfect grade magic treasures, it was because he was already a Terminator, and his abilities were far more powerful than the perfect grade magic treasures. The chaos within the black hole in the surroundings did not exceed the limits of what he could endure. After doing all that, Luo Fan smiled and raised his hand to pat forward. A ray of light instantly charged out from his hand and pounced towards the 36th saint. The ray of light contained all sorts of mysterious energy, and it formed countless profound laws and laws. As it pounced towards the saints, it left behind a domain that was similar to the laws and laws around him, and it was extremely similar to the end of days. The ray of light continued to advance, and the domain continued to spread. Very soon, it had arrived before the saints and was about to completely envelop them. Since those saints could transform their surroundings into such a huge black hole, it was impossible for them to be hit by this streak of light so easily. It was impossible for them to be engulfed by the Age of Chaos domain without any resistance. When the consciousness saw the laws and laws around Luo Fan suddenly change, it understood that the domain formed by the laws and laws was like poison to them. If they were really enveloped by it, their spirituality would definitely be greatly damaged, and they might even collapse in an instant. Although this sort of feeling was inconceivable and unbelievable to it, it clearly would not use its life to test it out. Thus, at that instant, it let out a soft shout, and as the space around it changed, an endless amount of space folded in front of the flowing light, causing the flowing light to seem to freeze in the air. Luo Fan smiled, secretly praising the cleverness of the consciousness. Saints could only appear in the era of saints. It was impossible for them to appear in other eras. Even if Luo Fan did not construct a domain of the Age of Chaos, and instead constructed a domain similar to the era of saints, these saints would definitely feel all sorts of obstructions and restrictions when they entered it. Even the speed at which their thoughts moved would become a lot slower. Not to mention that the end of days was called the end of days, and the rejection of inanimate objects gaining spirituality was naturally the greatest in all eras. When these saints entered it, they would instantly suffer the powerful impact of the endless laws and laws. Perhaps because of their extremely high innate qualities, they would not instantly collapse and die from such an impact, but they would probably have to put all their effort into maintaining their spirituality in order to maintain it. How could they possibly stop any of Luofan's actions? To be continued. Registered members can receive private benefits. Chapter 893. The Great Consciousness. Chapter 854. First written novel, fastest updated novel. However, it was clearly impossible for Luofan's ability to be restrained so easily. A slight difference in cultivation was like the difference between the heavens and the earth. Luofan was a Terminator that lived up to his name. Even though these saints possessed strength equivalent to Terminators, they were still inferior in essence. With a single command in his heart, the ray of light suddenly moved, and it instantly revealed some sort of profound effect. The folded space in the surroundings rumbled and collapsed under the effect of this effect, and then the ray of light instantly traversed towards the saints at an unimaginable speed. The consciousness formed by the 36 saints exclaimed with surprise, and then an indescribable fluctuation emanated from them. It warped the light and shadows in the surroundings, and it affected the boundless pulling force and twisting force in the surroundings. Under this influence, the heavens and the earth changed once more. The boundless warping light and shadows in the surroundings instantly vanished, and it was replaced by boundless space. 36 peerlessly enormous vortexes of light were scattered throughout this space, and they enveloped Luofan and the martial emperor. Obviously, these vortexes of light were formed by the 36 saints. It was even to the extent that it was very likely that these vortexes of light were their true forms, and they were numerous rivers. Of course, even though these vortexes of light were peerlessly enormous, they were still extremely tiny when compared to the rivers. So, it was naturally impossible for them to be the true forms of the rivers, and they were merely existences that were similar to avatars. Even then, the ray of light that Luofan emanated had become insignificant to the point of being negligible when compared to such a scale, and it was insignificant to the extreme. Even if it struck any of the vortexes of light, it would be unable to envelop them within the last day's domain, let alone completely envelop all 36 vortexes of light. What an amazing technique! Luofan praised endlessly. Using such a technique to render my attacks useless could truly be said to be extremely ingenious. However, such a method was still unable to stop Luofan from constructing the last day's domain to destroy the foundation of the saints. This was merely the smoothest and most perfect method, and even Luofan had expected it since the beginning. The possibility of such a method succeeding was rather small, so he wasn't really surprised when he saw it fail. With a thought, the stream of light disappeared without a trace. Then, his body swayed, and as invisible power was activated, it condensed into 36 gigantic arms in the void, as if they were real. Every single one of these arms could grasp those light vortexes. These arms were born from nothingness and exuded an incomparably real aura, as if they were the arms of a giant that could hold up the heavens. There were even traces of time on their skin, as if they had accumulated countless scars over countless years. After the arm took shape, it suddenly stretched out towards the 36 light vortexes. It covered down fiercely, wanting to grab the 36 light vortexes in the palm of its hand. As soon as the great consciousness of the saints saw the 36 arms, he knew that the power formed by the arms was extremely condensed and had already materialized. In essence, it was no different from a real giant's arm. If they were grabbed by such a huge and powerful arm, even if their bodies were a miniature galaxy, they would definitely not be able to withstand it. They would definitely be crushed into powder in an instant. Facing such an arm, the great consciousness became abnormally solemn. With a thought, the 36 light vortexes each trembled. The entire Earth and the universe, or rather, the projection of the entire Saint era, began to tremble. Boundless laws and laws quickly gathered in this place. In the blink of an eye, the 36 light vortexes gathered in one place, forming 36 laws and chains of laws that seemed like a curtain in the sky. The chains of laws and laws flickered with an indestructible and eternal luster, making people feel that if they were bound by the chains, even if the universe was destroyed and the world was destroyed, they would probably not be able to escape. The tails of the chains were triangular sharp blades. As soon as they appeared, they were like swimming dragons, swimming and leaping agilely. They suddenly charged up and charged at the 36 arms. At that moment, the 36 gigantic arms just happened to arrive above the 36 light vortexes and were about to press down. The arms could not dodge at all when the chains gathered and charged over. They were directly stabbed into the palms by the 36 gigantic chains of laws. As the 36 chains stabbed into the palms, the 36 arms suddenly paused. They were instantly locked in place and could no longer move. Luo Fan frowned slightly when he saw this. The 36 chains were condensed from the laws and laws of the entire Saint era, and their toughness had reached an unimaginable level. After being locked in place by these chains, the 36 arms seemed to be fixed by the entire Earth and universe. If Luo Fan wanted to move them, even if it was just a slight vibration, it was extremely difficult, as if an ordinary person was carrying a weight of thousands of kilograms. The chains were clearly not just sturdy. After passing through the 36 arms, they did not stop changing. Instead, they passed through the 36 arms in an instant. However, they did not appear behind the arms. Instead, they disappeared into the void. As they disappeared, more and more parts of the arms also disappeared. These arms were condensed by Luo Fan, so he was naturally very clear about the changes to them. When the parts of the arms disappeared, he could sense that they did not completely collapse into nothingness. Instead, they were separated by the chains of laws and sent to various regions of the earth and suppressed. These chains of laws and laws were formed from all the laws and laws of the entire Earth's universe and the era of the Saint. They were originally distributed in various regions of the Earth's universe, but because the consciousness of the 36 saints had unimaginable control over the Earth's universe, they were condensed into these chains. Therefore, as long as the great consciousness of the saints slightly changed its method, it would naturally be able to send these laws and laws back to their original places. If the various parts of the arm that Luo Fan had condensed were brought back, it would naturally be able to split these 36 arms into countless parts and suppress various areas of the Earth universe. This method was also very ingenious. It was the manifestation of the consciousness of the saints completely taking advantage of the various advantages of the Earth and universe. The speed at which the chains suppressed the arms was extremely fast. By the time Luo Fan figured out everything, the 36 arms had already completely disappeared. They had been scattered to various parts of the vast Earth and universe that had a radius of hundreds of millions of light-years. At this moment, the chains condensed out of thin air again. They appeared directly from where they had disappeared and continued to pierce towards Luo Fan. However, this time, in addition to the 36 huge chains of laws and laws, there were also 36 smaller chains of laws and laws that had condensed beside the chains. The large chains were aimed directly at Luo Fan, while the small chains were aimed at the martial emperor next to Luo Fan. The consciousness of the 36 saints was meticulous, so it naturally wouldn't forget about the martial emperor. Although it felt that the martial emperor was insignificant, it wouldn't let him go at this critical moment. Otherwise, who would be to blame if an accident happened? The martial emperor floated there, and he'd completely witnessed the battle between Luo Fan and the 36 saints. Those saints treated him as insignificant, but the martial emperor did not show any dissatisfaction. At this moment, he knew his own limit. The gap between him and Luo Fan was huge, and it had reached an unimaginable level. The gap between him and the 36 saints was also incomparably huge. Under such circumstances, he was completely clear about his mission. He knew that Luo Fan had left him here and not kept him in the universe in his sleeve in order to give him such a level of combat experience, so that he could absorb some nutrients that would be beneficial to his own cultivation. In other words, his mission here was not to help defeat his opponent, but to protect himself. Under such circumstances, he could only rejoice at the contempt of those saints. How could he be displeased? The chains of laws and laws that were aimed at the martial emperor were many times weaker than the chains that were aimed at Luo Fan. In the face of such chains of laws and laws, the martial emperor was extremely nervous. The martial character that floated above his head suddenly trembled, and countless shadows appeared out of nowhere, densely distributed in front of him. These lights and shadows contained everything in the universe, but their essence was martial arts. Or rather, they were created by the martial emperor based on martial arts. All things in the universe were transformed from the martial emperor's attainments in martial art. They contained all the secrets of the martial emperor's cultivation up to this point. More and more shadows appeared, and in the end, they were densely arranged in front of him, directly blocking the 36 chains and isolating the space between him and the 36 chains. The 36 chains were boundlessly fast, and they instantly pierced into the endless shadows. However, the silhouettes seemed to be real. They seemed to have opened up countless voids in front of the martial monarch. Although the chains continued to move forward, they continued to bring the silhouettes to various parts of the Earth's universe. The chains continued to shrink, but they were unable to pass through the silhouettes and approach the martial monarch's body. If those saints focused all their attention on the martial emperor, they would naturally be able to easily break through such a method. There was no other way. As long as they increased the size of the laws and the chains of laws and ensured that they did not shrink when they took away the light shadow, they would naturally be able to break through such a method and easily disperse the martial emperor to various parts of the Earth's universe. However, in the eyes of many saints, the martial emperor was just a lackey. Separating out these chains of laws and laws was already giving him a lot of face and attention. How could these saints waste too much energy on such a lackey? As a result, the martial emperor was in a stalemate and could be considered to be far from danger. The martial emperor had so easily blocked the attack, but he did not feel the slightest bit of joy. Instead, his expression changed, and he was inwardly shocked. This was because he understood that the 36 chains of law and law that were directed at him were unimaginably weak compared to the 36 chains of law and law that were directed at Luo Fan. Perhaps the difference between the heavens and the earth was insufficient to describe the gap between them. However, he still needed to display all of his martial arts comprehension in order to block these 36 chains. One could imagine how powerful the 36 chains that were attacking Luo Fan were. In his worry, the martial emperor focused most of his attention on Luo Fan, who was beside him. At this moment, the 36 chains had already pierced into Luo Fan's body without any obstruction. His palms, wrists, elbows, shoulders, thighs, knees, calves, ankles, soles of feet, neck, chest, abdomen, eyes, ears, back, waist, buttocks, and the back of his head, a total of 36 positions. Although the chains were incomparably huge, like pillars that supported the heavens, and were so huge that any one of them could crush a planet, they all easily pierced through the 36 parts of Luo Fan's body, which was the size of a normal person. During the entire process, the chains of laws and laws did not even shrink, nor did they show any signs of shrinking. It was as if the chains that pierced through every part of Luo Fan's body were still as huge as they were when they were first released. The entire scene seemed to be a bit contradictory, but it seemed incomparably natural, as if it was supposed to be like this. It was indescribably mysterious. How could this be? Even though these laws and chains of laws are astonishingly powerful, they shouldn't be much to Brother Luo. How did they penetrate his body so easily? The martial emperor's face was filled with shock. He could barely maintain the light in front of him. Fortunately, he reacted extremely quickly. At this moment, he noticed that there was no trace of panic on Luo Fan's face. He knew that although he did not know what Luo Fan was thinking or what he was thinking, the situation was not as dangerous as he had imagined. As a result, He gathered his thoughts and gathered the light in front of him once again to maintain his safety. Freeze! At this moment, he suddenly spat out a single word. The words and pronunciation of the word were extremely ordinary, but there was an indescribable charm to it. As the word rang out, the entire space, the entire universe, and even the chains of laws and laws instantly froze, as if they had been frozen in time. Let alone Luo Fan's body, he seemed like an eternally unmoving boulder, unshakable and indestructible. Those chains possessed an incomparably powerful decomposing and suppressing power. Even the 36 arms that Luo Fan had condensed before, which could instantly crush the doppelgangers of these saints, could not last for a few breaths under this power. The strength of the decomposing and suppressing power could be imagined. However, even with such powerful disintegration and suppression, it was inconceivable that Luo Fan had allowed the chains to penetrate his body so easily. After all, even a martial emperor could use various methods to block the chains, preventing them from approaching him. Although the chains against Luo Fan were many times more powerful than the chains against a martial emperor, Luo Fan was also much more powerful than a martial emperor. As such, if Luo Fan wanted to, he could naturally come up with many ways to stop the chains from penetrating his body. At this moment, the chains had already locked onto his body because Luo Fan had not stopped them. Luo Fan had deliberately allowed the chains of laws and laws to penetrate his body. The reason for this was because of what was happening right now. The chains of laws and laws were condensed by the great consciousness of the saints through the control of the 36 saints over the earth and the universe. The more powerful they were, the closer their connection with the saints was. At this moment, the 36 chains of laws and laws were so powerful that their connection with the saints naturally reached the origin. Therefore, Luo Fan could naturally grab the origin of the saints by following the 36 chains of laws and laws, and he did not need to get entangled with the saints' dharma bodies. At this moment, Luo Fan's plan had succeeded. Because the chains of laws and laws had been frozen by his powerful ability and could not move, the origin of the 36 saints had already appeared at the end of Luo Fan's perception. They were 36 balls of light that emitted eternal mysterious light. These balls of light revealed some kind of profound wisdom and holiness. It was all-encompassing, as if the mysteries of everything in the universe were contained within them. The extremely strong vitality was like the scorching sun. Even Luo Fan felt a little surprised. How can this be? At this moment, the great consciousness formed by the 36 saints let out a surprised and bewildered voice. At this moment, he felt as if he was already naked in front of this otherworldly demon. On the other hand, the chains that he had condensed, which contained all the rules and laws of the entire Earth's universe, had been completely frozen by an indescribable power. Although they had penetrated the body of the otherworldly demon and locked onto every inch of his body, they were unable to activate the power that could disperse and suppress his body parts. It was as if that body was an inseparable, eternal, and indestructible existence. In the blink of an eye, the consciousness of the 36 saints wanted to retreat. It wanted to retract the laws and the chains of laws and laws, but it realized that even this action could not be completed. The chains of laws and laws seemed to be an eternal existence. No matter how hard it tried, it could not be moved at all. It could not be moved at all. In an instant, the saint's consciousness finally understood something. It made a prompt decision to sever the connection between the chains of laws and its own origin, regardless of the consequences. Chapter 855. An indescribable power, the complete opposite of the power that defined the entire era of saints, condensed into 36 solid axes in the void. They followed the laws and the chains of laws and headed straight for the source of the 36 saints. The 36 balls of light emitted enough light to make Luo Fan glance sideways. This speed had reached an unimaginable level. Almost at the instant they condensed, They had already passed through the distant void layers of spacetime and directly blasted the 36 balls of light. An invisible roar instantly spread throughout the entire Earth universe, or rather, the entire era of Saint. In various parts of Earth's universe, 36 galaxies that were hundreds of millions of light-years away from each other collapsed and shattered at the same time. All the stars and planets within them turned into endless smoke, and under the effect of the laws of Earth's universe, they gradually dissipated as they drifted about. The entire Earth universe also shook violently with the collapse of these galaxies, and a sense of despair filled the void and filled the entire world. Next to the core projection of the era of Saints, as the light and shadow fluctuated, everything returned to normal. It was still the void, still an unpredictable invisible ball of light that emitted infinite wisdom. The 36 saints that were originally blocking the ball of light, or rather, the 36 saints that were in front of the core projection of the era of imagination, were now like sand. Countless specks of dust scattered from their bodies, and their bodies gradually collapsed and dissipated. In the end, we still can't reverse fate. A leisurely sigh sounded out of nowhere. It was the voice of the consciousness of the many saints. After this voice, the bodies of the saints finally completely turned into dust and collapsed and disappeared without a trace. The laws and the chains of laws that had penetrated various parts of Luo Fan's body also disappeared in an instant, as if they had never appeared. As the laws and the chains of laws that had penetrated Luo Fan's body disappeared, the laws and the chains of laws that were constantly rushing towards the martial emperor also disappeared at the same time, as if they had never appeared. The martial emperor's face revealed a look of disappointment. He had a thought. The countless lights and shadows in front of him instantly disappeared, and the martial character that had condensed above his head also turned into nothingness. In the end, he retracted it back into his body. Unfortunately, my eyesight is still insufficient. I'm utterly unable to see exactly how Brother Luo annihilated them. The martial emperor sighed emotionally in his mind. After he sighed with emotion, he released all the Khanate perfected heaven realm cultivators that he'd kept in the void, and they appeared by his side. In an instant the treasure light soared into the sky. It illuminated the originally empty void, making it seem rather lively. These Khanate golden immortal realm cultivators were still using their perfected grade magic treasures to protect themselves. Clearly, even though they had been taken into the martial emperor's space, and were protected by the martial emperor, they did not feel too safe. They were not confident that the martial emperor could completely protect them, so they still took out great perfection artifacts to protect them. At this moment, they looked around and realized that everything had returned to how it had been when they had arrived at the era projection core. They understood that the 36 saints had been dealt with by Luo Fan or the martial emperor. For a time, a rather complicated feeling arose in their hearts. Some were delighted, some were shocked, some were dejected, some were terrified, some were excited, and so on and so forth. Fellow Taoists, the 3333rd barrier has undergone such a huge change. Obviously, it shows that this barrier carries a special meaning. The next barrier will definitely undergo a huge change. Perhaps even the way it appears will change. I hope all of you can prepare yourselves. Luo Fan turned around to look at the Khanate golden immortal realm cultivators as he spoke. Luo Fan's guess was naturally not baseless. The 3333rd barrier that they'd experienced after stepping foot onto the era bridge was a projection of an era. Even though every single era was different and seemed to be extremely strange, it was unimaginably complicated. But in any case, they were all projections of the various eras. There was no difference in essence at all. At this very moment, it just so happened to be a third of the 3,333 checkpoints that such a great change had occurred. To be able to condense a saint that surpassed Khanate Grand Luo and was comparable to the destroyers, it definitely meant that the era projection's checkpoint had come to an end. Since the barrier had come to an end, It was naturally impossible for the next barrier to be the same as before. It was very likely that it would change into something completely beyond everyone's imagination. The connate golden immortal realm cultivators were not ordinary people after all. Most of them had expected this, so they nodded in silence when they heard Luo Fan's words. Luo Fan did not say anything when he saw this. He turned around and faced the extremely profound ball of light in front of him. With a single thought, an enormous axe condensed in space. The axe was rather similar to the energy condensed from the axe that had annihilated the 36 saints. However, it was more solid, and the aura it emanated was even more vast and shocking. The aura of the axe was even more obvious. As soon as the axe was condensed, it descended without hesitation and slashed towards the extremely profound ball of light. Earlier, killing the 36 saints was equivalent to destroying the resistance of the era of saints. At this moment, Luo Fan's actions did not cause the era of saints to resist at all. There was practically no obstruction as the axe he condensed slashed into the ball of light. The ball of light suddenly shook when the axe slashed into it. After that, countless pitch-black cracks appeared on the surface of the ball of light, and they grew larger and more obvious. In the end, it shook and instantly collapsed into countless fragments that spread towards the surroundings. The scene of the end of the world that the connate golden immortal realm cultivators had been waiting for a long time instantly appeared before their eyes. At the same time, over 10,000 times more information than when the projections of the other eras were destroyed suddenly appeared out of thin air and descended into Luo Fan's mind. It made Luo Fan instantly feel like he had fallen into a boundless ocean of information. The endless information was like waves that madly battered against his body and mind. Even though his mind was at the level of a destroyer, he could not help but be overwhelmed by the information. After a long while, he barely managed to stabilize himself and extricate his mind from the boundless information. He completely regained control. I see. As expected, this is the last barrier that exists in this form. Luo Fan let out a long sigh. He knew that he would never be able to return to the place where he could do whatever he wanted. The information that descended into Luo Fan's mind from nothingness was nothing else. It was the entire process of the era of saints from its current time period until its destruction and replacement by other eras. However, compared to the information projected from the other eras, this information was more than 10,000 times more detailed. Although it contained the same period of time, the information was more than 10,000 times more detailed. If Luo Fan was not an destroyer and was only an connate golden immortal realm cultivator, his mind might be instantly shattered by the information. Even if his soul was not destroyed, he would definitely be heavily injured and would need a long time to recover. It was the same for Luo Fan. If this information was placed on a martial emperor or other connate golden immortal realm cultivators, the outcome would definitely be even more miserable. Perhaps in an instant, they would directly assimilate into that information. They would completely lose themselves and become a living dead that was no different from having their soul destroyed and body destroyed. As for why there was such a huge difference in the historical process of the birth and death of an era that spanned billions of years, the reason was relatively simple. This information was indeed the historical process of the birth and destruction of billions of years ago. However, the method of obtaining this information was not through personal experience. Instead, it was through the profundities of the bridge of the era and the unique power of the bridge of the era to directly project this information. It was brought into the mind and consciousness of living beings. Under such circumstances, the information projected was naturally limited by the era bridge. In other words, it was limited by the various barriers on the bridge. This limitation was displayed. It was the degree of authenticity and detail of the projection. The biggest difference between the projection from the other eras and the projection from the era of the saints was the degree of realism. Apart from the era of the saints, which other era could project an existence comparable to an Terminator. Moreover, it could discover Luo Fan and the others and stop them at all costs? Hence, it was extremely natural that the information of the backlash of the era of Saints far surpassed the projections of the other eras. When Luo Fan returned to his senses, he instantly sensed the difference in his surroundings. In the past, every time the projection of an era was destroyed, it would naturally enter the projection of the next era. There had never been any process in between. It was as if the projections of the eras were layered on top of each other. When one was destroyed, the other would be revealed. However, at this moment, their surroundings were not like the void of the universe. Instead, it was gray and hazy, as if they were shrouded by an extremely dense fog. This thick fog was extremely mysterious. It completely isolated all perception, making everyone feel as if they were thrown into a thick fog alone. The fog was almost an absolute obstruction to other connate golden immortal realm cultivators. However, it was nothing to Luo Fan. Luo Fan was already in Destroyer. The world that his eyes could see far surpassed that of connate golden immortal realm cultivators. In his eyes, the fog only vaguely blocked the light and shadows around him. It was as if his eyes were covered by a thin layer of fog. At this moment, the voice of the treasure spirit of the bridge of the eras rang out. It completely ignored the obstruction of the fog and was heard by the many connate golden immortal realm cultivators. This is the 3334th stage. It's a forbidden area for cultivators, the 6 absolute nebula. The way to pass this stage is to destroy the nebula. So it's a projection of a forbidden area from another era. The difficulty is indeed much higher than the 3,300 stages from before. When Luo Fan heard the voice, he instantly understood what the 3,334th stage was all about. He could not help but sigh inwardly. This was only a projection of a forbidden area from a certain era, and it seemed countless times weaker than the projection of the entire era. However, in reality, these projections were countless times more realistic than the projections of those eras. At the very least, at this moment, the projection of the 6 absolute nebula was no less illusory than the projection of the era of Saint. This degree of realism was enough to project all kinds of sinister creatures and sinister forces in the 6 absolute nebula. To destroy such a forbidden area, one would need countless battles and dangers. This would require countless battles and countless dangers. The difficulty would naturally be much higher than the previous projections of the eras, which would only be resisted at the final moments of the Age of Destruction. It was much more dangerous. Naturally, the difficulty of the stages was much higher. The 6 absolute nebula was clearly a place that isolated the 5 senses and 6 types of senses. Many of the connate golden immortal realm cultivators present were completely unfamiliar with such a forbidden area. Even Old Man Omniscient, who claimed to know everything, had never heard of the existence of a forbidden area like the 6 absolute nebula. In an instant, they understood that the 6 absolute nebula was clearly a projection taken from some future eras, just like the projections of those eras before. All their senses had been isolated, so the connate golden immortal realm cultivators naturally immediately utilized their divine abilities to protect themselves. It was even to the extent that some connate golden immortal realm cultivators that were even more cautious directly withdrew their perfection stage magic treasures, causing them to emanate a hazy glow that protected their entire bodies. However, when these perfected grade magic treasures appeared, the connate golden immortal realm cultivators were overjoyed, because they discovered those great perfection level magic treasures could actually distort the surrounding laws to a certain extent. Although they couldn't completely use their own extended laws to replace the internal laws of the 6 absolute nebula, it was enough for them to sense the surrounding situation. Even though they couldn't sense each other, the numerous connate golden immortal realm cultivators were still able to communicate with each other through some special technique. Thus, when the first person discovered the miraculous effect of the perfect rank magic treasure, every single connate golden immortal realm cultivator found out about it. For a time, treasure light soared into the sky, interweaving to form an area formed by treasure light, barely isolating the surrounding fog. It allowed the connate golden immortal realm cultivators to see each other again. Even though the martial monarch didn't have a great perfection level magic treasure, he had studied it when Luo Fan was refining great perfection level magic treasures, so he was able to imitate this miraculous effect with his martial technique. Similarly, he was able to sense the surrounding situation through his martial technique. Looks like this 6 absolute nebula has its limits. Not all living beings' senses can be restricted. When Luo Fan saw this, he understood another characteristic of the 6 absolute nebula. If I want to destroy this 6 absolute nebula, I have to find the source of this nebula. Only by finding the source can I destroy it. Then, Luo Fan thought of a way to get past this nebula. Otherwise, I won't be able to do anything. Then, Luo Fan thought of a way to get past this nebula. Everything had a core. Even era projections had their own core. It was impossible for this 6 absolute nebula to not have a core. The form of existence of the core might be very ordinary, or it might be very special. Perhaps it was the origin of the 6 absolute nebula, the root of the 6 absolute nebula's characteristics, or perhaps it was just a special point in the structure of the 6 absolute nebula. No matter what form it took, such an existence must exist. It could affect the life and death of the entire 6 absolute nebula. This point was the core of the 6 absolute nebula. However, it didn't mean that the 6 absolute nebula definitely had something that supported its existence. From this, it could be seen that to Luo Fan, the core of this thing was similar to the power that defined a certain era as a certain era. It was also in a broad sense. It was only because a certain location or something was related to the life and death of the Forbidden Land that it was called the core. However, it was not because it was the core that it could affect the life and death of the Forbidden Land. It was precisely because his definition of the core was so broad that he dared to say that everything had a core. That was why he dared to say that as long as he found the core, he would be able to destroy it. In fact, the core of the previous era's projection had a similar definition. However, the core was usually the origin of the power that defined that era. In other words, it was the origin of the various factors that define that era. That was why it showed such a pattern. Such a conclusion was naturally not something that any connate grand heavenly realm cultivator could obtain. However, to those connate grand heavenly realm cultivators, no matter what the form of these barriers looked like or how special they were still barriers. Since they were barriers, they naturally had the key to overcome them, and they naturally had the core to overcome them. From this aspect, they knew that no matter what the barriers were, the key was to find their core. There was no need for Luo Fan to explain. At this moment, everyone could barely communicate with each other. After some discussion, they decided to act like before and split up to search for the core of the 6 absolute nebula. During the process of deciding, many connate grand heavenly realm cultivators paid attention to Luo Fan's opinion. As long as Luo Fan showed the slightest sign of disagreement, they would understand that Luo Fan wasn't satisfied with the decision, and they would naturally change it. That was the charm of strength. However, Luo Fan obviously didn't care too much about their opinions. He didn't pay much attention to how they discussed. Instead, he paid more attention to the surroundings and the 6 absolute nebula. He was looking for the quintessence profundities of the 6 absolute nebula so that he could find its core. Thus, Luo Fan remained expressionless throughout the entire process, and he didn't express any opinion. However, this didn't affect everyone's resolution at all, and it was completely in line with their original expectations. To be continued.